There's no floor overlap or floor gap. The whole thing is just a uniform shade of blue. When the wall leans a little forwards, now there's a floor gap. You can tell because there's some white in the middle of all the blue. And remember, that white area is actually covered by the wall triangle, but that doesn't really do anything. And finally, when the wall leans very far forwards, then the wall turns into a floor which covers the gap. So yeah, it's only the one case that causes floor gaps. But interestingly, floor gaps don't necessarily cause invisible walls. See, there are actually 3 cases for what effect a floor gap has because it depends on what's below the floor gap. Case 1, there's another floor below the floor gap. In this case, Mario can freely jump over the floor gap and not hit any invisible walls. He can also go into the floor gap and fall through to the floor below, assuming there are no wall hitboxes in the way. Then case 2, there are no floors below the floor gap. Like we saw a second ago, this lets a tiny sliver of out of bounds leak through. If Mario jumps into that sliver, he'll bonk, and if he walks into it, he'll push. And then case 3, there's a ceiling below the floor gap. This ceiling has a lower hitbox, but we don't care about that. It's the upper hitbox that causes a tiny sliver of ceiling to leak through. So this would also count as an exposed ceiling hitbox. And just like the sliver of out of bounds, the sliver of ceiling lets us bonk on it and lets us push on it. So it's only case 2 and case 3 that cause invisible walls. Now if you ever encounter an invisible wall like this, it might not be obvious whether it's from out of bounds or from a ceiling. Since you know, invisible walls are invisible, so in the game, we wouldn't see the hitbox colors that I'm showing here. But remember, only ceilings cut short your upwards trajectory. So a quick and simple way to distinguish between these 2 cases is to jump up into the invisible wall. If it lets you jump up, then it's out of bounds, and if it stops you from jumping up, then it's a ceiling. So let's look at an example. In Bob on Battlefield, there's this wall on a floor seam. Here are the floor edges on both sides of the seam, which are subdivided differently due to the steps. And based on those, here are the edge vertices. Now you may be wondering why it looks like I'm showing the same thing on the left and the right. Well, they're actually different camera modes. See, the one on the left is a perspective view, meaning that things get smaller as they go farther away from the camera. So it's like the normal camera mode that you'd see in the game. In contrast, the one on the right is an orthographic view, meaning that things stay the same size regardless of how far away from the camera they are. This orthographic view is useful because it allows us to have a nice looking top-down view. So next, let's show all the course's floor triangles, and now we're going to zoom in on each edge vertex to see how it misses its edge. Like, does it cause a floor overlap or a floor gap? The way this one misses is by causing a floor gap, because you can see the white area between the floors. Then for the next edge vertex, it also causes a floor gap, and for the last one, this one's a little weird. See, the bottom of the step and the top of the step don't actually line up, even though they were meant to. That's what actually causes the side of that third step to be a floor instead of a wall, like we saw before. But anyway, this just means we have 2 edge vertices to look at instead of 1, and they both cause floor gaps. So let's zoom out a little, and now you can see that there are integer coordinates that lie on the white area between floors, meaning that those points are out of bounds. Now let's remove the triangle fill color so that we can mark which unit squares are out of bounds. For each of those integer coordinates, let's add the arrow facing away from the origin, and then fill in those unit squares with gray for out of bounds. And now let's pan across the seam so that we can see all of the unit squares of out of bounds. So each of the unit squares on the right represents a little sliver of out of bounds that leaks through the leaning wall. And as we're panning on the right, I'm adding these slivers on the left so that you can see them in 3D. They're basically square columns that are 1 unit wide, though I'm drawing them each as 1 pixel wide because that's what's easiest to see. So that's the whole seam. Interestingly, there's one point near the middle of the seam that lies on the x-axis, so that point has 2 arrows and causes 2 unit squares of invisible wall. So yeah, that's how the out of bounds units are distributed along the seam. On the left, if we zoom in a bit, you can see the 2 unit columns in the middle that are extra close together, since they're both from that point on the x-axis. And if we step back a little, you can see just how high up this invisible wall goes, all the way to the top of the course, at a height of 32,768. So it's pretty weird. There's just this invisible wall in the course that goes way higher up than anything else. And of course, because it's an invisible wall, that means anytime you go through that spot, you may end up bonking on it seemingly out of nowhere. On the other hand, you may end up passing right through it. So why is it that you only hit it sometimes? Well, let me explain. Here's a top-down view of the unit grid, and let's say we have invisible wall units on a seam like this. Now normally, invisible wall units are at a slanted angle, but just to keep this demonstration simple, we're going to say that they're all in a nice row like this. And let's say Mario's currently south of the invisible wall seam and wants to cross it going north. Now it's important to understand exactly how Mario's movement works. So Mario has a horizontal speed, which represents how many units forwards he moves per frame. For example, if Mario's speed is 8, then he moves 8 units forwards per frame. But even that's a bit of an oversimplification because the game doesn't move Mario forwards all at once. Instead, it takes his speed and subdivides it into 4 equal pieces called quarter steps. So a speed of 8 would be subdivided into 4 quarter steps, each having a size of 2. Then on each frame, Mario moves forwards by 4 quarter steps. So in the game, you'd see Mario before he does the 4 quarter steps, you'd see Mario after he does the 4 quarter steps, but you wouldn't see him at these intermediate positions because they happen mid-frame. But I'll still show them here because they're very relevant for this discussion. So here, I'm making full steps pink and quarter steps yellow so that it's easy to distinguish them. Earlier, when I showed movement arrows, they were kind of a mishmash between quarter steps and full steps because I was simplifying. But you see, it's only every full step that Mario's animation updates and gravity applies, while it's every quarter step that floors, walls, ceilings, and out of bounds apply. Since here, we're interested in whether Mario hits invisible wall units, which are ceilings and out of bounds, we're only going to focus on the quarter step arrows. And I'll add even more arrows to his pathing, because we're interested in whether he hits the invisible wall at any point in his pathing, not just on the next frame. Anyway, since Mario's moving forwards 2 units at a time, that covers every second unit. That means there are 2 kinds of spacings, a spacing like this, and a spacing that's offset by 1 unit like this. You can think of them as one covers the even unit squares and one covers the odd unit squares. If we look at the invisible wall seam, you can see that the pathing on the left skips straight over the seam while the pathing on the right hits it. Since invisible walls stop your movement, I'll remove all the arrows after the collision and put this symbol at the collision point. So in this example, there's a 50% chance that we hit the invisible wall, since 1 out of every 2 spacings hits it. Another way to see this is if we take just one of the spacings and move the starting point continuously. You can see that half the time it makes it through and half the time it stops. So that's why invisible walls can seem sort of random. Even though they're always there and don't move, you're not guaranteed to hit them when you cross the seam. Instead, it just comes down to whether your spacing crosses over it or goes into it. So in theory, you could always avoid hitting them by controlling your spacing just right, but in practice, at least casually, that's way too precise to control. But luckily, there are some other factors that are easier to control that also affect how often you hit an invisible wall. For example, your speed. So far, we've just been working with a speed of 8, which has quarter steps of size 2. But let's double that to 16 speed, which has quarter steps of size 4. This time we have 4 different spacings, which you can think of as covering all the unit squares that are a multiple of 4, 1 more than a multiple of 4, 2 more than a multiple of 4, and 3 more than a multiple of 4. There wouldn't be any more than that, because if we added a 5th one, 4 more than a multiple of 4, then really it's just the same spacing as the first case, but starting 1 quarter step forwards. But anyway, you can see that only one of the 4 spacings hits the invisible wall, meaning that there's a 1/4 chance of hitting it. And just like before, we can also see this by taking one of the spacings and moving it continuously. Most of the time it makes it through, but 1/4 of the time it hits the invisible wall and stops. So at 8 speed, there was a 50% chance of hitting the invisible wall, and at 16 speed, there was only a 25% chance of hitting it. So basically, the faster Mario's moving, the smaller the chance of hitting the invisible wall. Because more speed means your quarter steps cover more distance, and then they're more likely to pass right over the invisible wall units. Separately, your chance of hitting the invisible wall also depends on Mario's angle to the invisible wall seam. Currently, we're moving perpendicularly to the seam, which is optimal if you're trying to avoid hitting the invisible wall. So that'll be the control case, and we'll compare it to this case of Mario turned at an angle. At this angle, each quarter step moves 3.5 units to the right and 2 units forwards. Now if you think about this, the 3.5 units to the right doesn't contribute towards crossing the seam, and so it's like that part of the movement is going to waste at this angle. It's only the 2 units forwards that makes progress towards crossing the seam. If we move both cases vertically, you can see that the angled case hits the invisible wall twice as much as the control case, since the control case moves forwards 4 units at a time, while the angled case moves forwards only 2 units at a time. So even though they're the same speed, the angle changes how much of your speed contributes towards getting past the invisible wall. Going perpendicularly uses all of the speed to try to get past the invisible wall, while a slanted angle only uses a component of the speed to try to get past it. And now watch this. If we make Mario's angle even more slanted, now he moves 3.9 units to the right and only 1 unit forwards. Since the invisible wall is 1 unit thick, that means Mario can't even cross it now. See, no matter where he starts, his quarter steps just don't move forwards enough to cross the seam. So to recap so far, if you're trying to avoid hitting an invisible wall, then you should be moving at a fast speed and moving perpendicularly to the seam. But if you're trying to hit the invisible wall, then you should be moving at a slow speed and moving nearly parallel to the seam. But there are also properties of the invisible wall itself that affect how often you'd hit it. Up until now, we've just been looking at the simplest example of an invisible wall, which is a 1 unit thick continuous seam. But invisible walls often don't look like this. For example, maybe we have an invisible wall that looks like this, where it's 2 units thick. Now if we look at all the spacings, we can see that 2 of the 4 spacings hit it, which is a 50% chance. In other words, the thicker the invisible wall is, the higher the chance of hitting it. On the other hand, we might instead have something more like this, where only every second unit on the seam is an invisible wall. Now, not only do we have 4 possible vertical spacings, but we have 2 possible horizontal spacings, because you may or may not line up with an invisible wall unit. To illustrate this, we can subdivide each of the existing cases into 2 cases. So now, we have 4 different classes of vertical spacings, 3 of them cross right over the seam, but 1 of them lands on the seam directly. Not necessarily on an invisible wall unit, but just on the seam. And separately, we have 2 different classes of horizontal spacings. One of them passes between the invisible wall units, while the other one lines up with an invisible wall unit. So in total, that's 8 possible spacings, only 1 of which hits the invisible wall. So there's a 1 in 8 chance of hitting it. Another way of saying it is, there's a 1 in 4 chance that we land on the seam, and a 1 in 2 chance that we line up with an invisible wall unit, so multiply those together and you get that there's a 1 in 8 chance of hitting the invisible wall. And note that this is in comparison to before when it was a continuous seam, where we had a 1/4 chance of hitting it. But now that it's half as dense, we only have half that chance of hitting it, which is 1/8. So basically, the denser the invisible wall is, the higher the chance of hitting it. And finally, many invisible walls don't even have a uniform spacing along the whole seam. For example, maybe it's more dense on the left and less dense on the right. In this case, trying to cross it on the left side is more likely to hit it, and trying to cross it on the right side is less likely to hit it. So yeah, that's the basics of interacting with this kind of invisible wall. That should help you understand and appreciate the rest of the examples as we go through them. Now, I'm not just going to show you a few examples and call it a day. That's not how we do things here. Instead, I'm going to show you every invisible wall in the game, for a few reasons. First, I want this video to serve as a reference guide for every invisible wall, showing where they are and what they look like. That way, the next time you bump into one, you can come back here and see exactly why it's there. And second, I want to show you just how prevalent invisible walls are, and just how glitchy this game is. That way, you won't feel so bad about bumping into invisible walls. They're so abundant that you didn't really stand a chance. So, if you do want to see every example, because you want to know every inch of this game's weirdness, then you can just sit back and relax as I break it all down for you. And if you don't want to watch all the examples, because you see some of them and get the gist of it, that's fine too. You can skip forward to the next section using YouTube's chapter system. And so now, let's get into the examples. So also in Bob on Battlefield, we have this wall on the bar fence. Based on how its edges are subdivided, it has one edge vertex on the bottom, which misses its edge by causing a floor gap. And so that means that all along the seam are units of out of bounds. Note that the density of this invisible wall varies along the seam, and there are even some gaps in it. And so basically, if you ever go above this bar fence, you may end up bonking on this invisible wall. And remember earlier when I showed that you could bonk inside a ceiling hitbox and get reflected every frame? Well, you can also do that on this kind of invisible wall, essentially by wedging yourself between 2 of the unit columns. Playing it again, if we pause it and zoom in, we can see exactly what's going on. So on this frame, Mario does a quarter step going forwards as part of the dive action. This quarter step lands on a unit square of out of bounds, so it gets cancelled and Mario bonks. Though note that Mario's bonking animation is 1 frame behind what it should be, so on the left it doesn't quite look like he bonked yet. I mean, you can see the star particles, but his animation is still diving. But he's bonking, so next he moves backwards a quarter step, which also lands on a unit square of out of bounds, so that gets cancelled too, and Mario reflects his angle. And now since he's still bonking, he does another quarter step backwards the other way, which also lands on a unit square of out of bounds. So that quarter step gets cancelled and causes another reflection. And now we're back to the same state as before, so it just repeats over and over. Mario just bounces back and forth between those two unit squares. So yeah, that's why that can happen. Then still in Bob-omb Battlefield, we have this wall on the far side of the gap in the mountain path. It has two edge vertices on the top. Interestingly, the left edge vertex causes a floor overlap, so that's fine, but the edge vertex on the right causes a floor gap, which is where the problem is. So near
The
that
Dr.
right edge
Worm,
vertex,
what?
we have some unit columns of out of bounds, specifically two groups of them. Now this invisible wall is especially evil because if you hit it, you fall into the gap. Like, I can't imagine a worse place in Bob-omb Battlefield to have an invisible wall than on the far side of a gap you have to jump over. Then even still in Bob-omb Battlefield, we have this wall right after the bridge on the mountain path. It's kind of a weird shape, but it has one edge vertex on the top near the bridge. This edge vertex misses its edge by causing a floor gap, which means that there are some unit columns of out of bounds near the bridge. And interestingly, if we zoom in on the bridge, you can see that some of the unit columns actually rise up into the bridge, and so they stop there instead of continuing to rise up. But anyway, that means that for this gap too, if you try to jump over it, you may end up hitting this invisible wall and falling into the gap. And one more in Bob-omb Battlefield, we have this wall below the upper alcove in the mountain. It has two edge vertices. Zooming in, we can see that the right one causes a floor overlap and the left one causes a floor gap. So the result is that mainly on the left side of the alcove, we have some unit columns of out of bounds, and these ones are fully contained within the alcove. So this means anytime you enter or exit this alcove, you might bonk on this invisible wall. Then in Jolly Roger Bay, we have this wall on the right side of this alcove. It has one edge vertex on the top. Will there be a floor overlap or a floor gap? It's a floor gap. I mean, it has to be. Otherwise, why would we be here examining it? Now, a cool thing about this one is that it only has 4 unit columns of out of bounds, so you can see each one of them individually. And since this one's in water, we can swim into it, which cancels our movement, and so we just end up swimming in place. So it looks pretty odd. Then in the Jolly Roger Bay ship, we've got a lot going on. So first, there's this lowest platform that has a wall with an edge vertex, and so it has an invisible wall on its edge. Then next, we have this slightly higher platform. Very similar thing going on here, because the bottom of this wall has an edge vertex leading to another invisible wall. Then on one of the higher platforms, we have yet another wall with an edge vertex that causes an invisible wall. So that makes 3 platforms with invisible walls, but can we get a 4th one? And yes, we can, on the highest platform of them all. This time, the wall's a slightly different shape and there are only 3 unit columns of out of bounds. So yeah, those are the 4 platforms with this type of invisible wall. So if you thought climbing up these platforms was hard on its own, just remember that out of nowhere you might bonk on one of these invisible walls. But hey, at least now you know where they are so you can avoid them. Or hit them on purpose if that's what you're into. I'm not here to judge. Then in Cool Cool Mountain, we have this wall. It's like an upside down triangle, so it has one edge vertex on the bottom. Now if we show all the floors except the death barrier, you can see that there are some floor gaps. But this time, they're filled with ceiling instead of out of bounds. Because if we look on the bottom of this structure, we can see the ceiling down here, whose upper hitbox leaks through those floor gaps. So what that means is that all along the seam, there are unit columns of ceiling leaking through. Now as a general rule, in courses with death barriers, all the invisible walls coming out of floor gaps will be due to ceilings and not out of bounds. Because think about it, if the course has a death barrier, then the whole thing is protected from out of bounds. That means you wouldn't find out of bounds anywhere in the main part of the course. And it's not like the course geometry can generate its own out of bounds, that's not how that works. Here's another way to think about it. Let's say we have a floor and it has a floor gap in it. In order for this floor gap to have out of bounds under it, there would have to be no floor under it, because that's what out of bounds means. But even if the main part of the course doesn't have any floors under it, the death barrier is still guaranteed to be a floor under it. So it's just not possible to have out of bounds come out of the floor gap. Instead, the only way for there to be an invisible wall coming out of the floor gap would be if there's a ceiling hitbox leaking through it, because courses can generate their own ceiling hitboxes. Now let me clarify how jumping into ceiling columns works. Basically, there are 3 cases. Case 1, you move into the ceiling column while falling down. In this case, your quarter step gets cancelled and you bonk, assuming you're moving fast enough. Then case 2, you move into the ceiling column while moving upwards. Then your quarter step gets cancelled and the ceiling cuts short your upwards trajectory, meaning you'll now start falling down. But then let's say you miss the ceiling column on the next frame, either because your speed changed or you're holding a slightly different angle on the control stick. Then you'll pass right through the invisible wall and continue with your trajectory, though it'll now be moving downwards. And then case 3, you move into the ceiling
like a guy would
column
fuck with.
while
Oh, I've heard of them, but I
so your
haven't
quarter
listened
step
to them.
gets cancelled and it cuts short your upwards trajectory, and then you hit the ceiling column again on the next frame with your downwards trajectory. Then just like the first case, your quarter step gets cancelled and you bonk, assuming you're moving fast enough. So it kinda looks like you went straight from moving upwards to bonking, but it was actually a 2-frame process because of the way ceilings work. So yeah, those are the 3 main interactions that can happen when you jump into a seam of ceiling hitbox. So going back to the game, let me show you what these interactions look like. So first I hit the ceiling while moving downwards, which causes me to bonk. Next I hit it while moving upwards and then miss it afterwards, so it cuts short my triple jump. And then I hit it 2 frames in a row, so it looks like I go straight from moving upwards to bonking, but it actually took 2 frames. And like I mentioned earlier, an easy way to confirm that this invisible wall is a ceiling is to just walk into it and then try jumping. You can see that my jumps don't go anywhere, meaning it's a ceiling. On the other hand, if we push against an invisible wall that's out of bounds and then try jumping, the jumps actually go up. Then next in Cool Mountain, we have this wall. It's a pretty interesting shape because there's like a little overhang structure on the right, and here are the relevant edge vertices. So the first one misses by causing a floor gap, then a floor overlap. Now let's zoom out and hide some of the lower floors to make this next part easier to see. So then we have a floor overlap, and the last one is a floor gap. And based on our earlier discussion, you should already know that these ones are going to be ceiling leaking through and not out of bounds, since Cool Mountain has a death barrier. Now you can see that there are 2 sections of invisible wall. The section on the left is due to this ceiling on the underside of the wood, and the section on the right is due to this ceiling on the underside of the overhang. So these invisible walls could get in your way if you're doing movement near the red coin star. And remember, the bridge flap invisible wall is around here too, so surely there wouldn't be a 3rd one around here, right? Well, also in Cool Mountain, there's this wall, right next door to the previous one we looked at. Now this wall is actually made up of 2 floors, 2 ceilings, and 2 walls. And it's the big wall on the left that's the issue. It's another triangle, so it has 1 edge vertex on the bottom. This edge vertex misses the edge by causing a floor gap, resulting in 2 sections of invisible wall. The section on the right is due to this ceiling triangle that we've been looking at the whole time, and the section on the left is due to this ceiling down here, you know, the top of the little cave. And so basically, if you're messing around near the blue coins, you might just bump into this invisible wall. Now this invisible wall is interesting because it's actually used in the task for collecting 100 coins while doing the Big Penguin race, which was tasked by Crackhex. See, she uses the invisible wall to backwards long jump in order to get lots of speed. That makes for a quick trip back up the mountain to enter the cabin for the penguin race. Now I've talked about backwards long jumping a couple times, but I haven't really explained it, so let me do that now. So Mario has a move called a long jump that you can do by pressing Z and then A while you're moving. Now the cool thing about a long jump is that when you start it, it multiplies your speed by 1.5. Let me show this on the graph. If we start with 1 speed and then continuously long jump, our speed increases by more and more each time, because each time it multiplies by 1.5, or in other words, gets 50% bigger. Now the programmers didn't want you to be able to get infinite speed this way, so they capped it at a maximum of 48 speed. So a long jump will never go above 48 speed. But the programmers made a little oversight because they forgot about the negative numbers. So let's say we start with -1 speed. Now if we start continuously long jumping, our speed will decrease by more and more, since multiplying by 1.5 just makes these negative numbers more negative. And this time there's no cap, because the programmers never put a minimum speed that a long jump can do. So basically, we can get unlimited negative speed by long jumping backwards. And so we call it a backwards long jump, or BLJ. Now, doing backwards long jumps doesn't automatically result in unlimited negative speed. That's because even though the starting speed of a long jump is uncapped, Mario loses speed while he's in the air from the long jump. So trying to backwards long jump on a flat floor with nothing else won't work because Mario loses too much speed in the air. Looking at the speed value, you can see that I get to -20 speed right after starting a long jump, but then it goes back to -15 by the time I land and can do the next long jump. To avoid losing all this speed, we need to do a bunch of backwards long jumps in quick succession. So you can do this on a steep floor, because then each long jump lands back on the floor instantly, and so you can do a bunch of long jumps in a row without any airtime. You can also do it on a rising platform, because the platform rises into your jump, so you land instantly
You go so
and
fast.
can then backwards long jump again. And finally, you can do it using a ceiling, because the ceiling makes you land instantly instead of letting you jump up. See, it's all coming together. So going back to the cool mountain task, let's pause it, zoom in, and now I'll show Mario's movement arrows. And I'll make the arrows green if they're on the first frame of a long jump. So you can see that each backwards long jump was strategically done to move into a ceiling column, which prevents Mario from jumping up and instead makes him land right after. That allows Mario to do the next backwards long jump right away, and so he's able to build up speed very quickly by doing that. So see, invisible walls can actually be helpful for something. Then in Big Boo's Haunt, we have this wall on a seam between floors. Now you might be wondering what floor the magenta line belongs to. Well, there are actually some invisible intangible floor triangles in this room covering the giant gap in the floor. So why are they there? Well, you see, when Mario's in a course with rooms,
Who likes zoinks?
Haunt, then only 1 or 2 rooms are active at a time. Specifically, the game activates the room that Mario's in and any room that he's next to the door of. And the way the game figures out which rooms to activate is based on the floor triangle that Mario's above. So to put it simply, if Mario's above a floor in room A, then room A will be active. If he's above a floor in room B, then room B will be active. And if he's above a sort of intermediate floor, usually next to a door, then both room A and room B will be active. Now this system works pretty well, but think about how it would work in this room. The thing about this room is that there's a big gap in the floor that leads to the room down below. Since Mario's current room is based on which floor he's above, in theory that would mean jumping over the gap would change your room to the room down below. That'd be bad because then the room down below would be active instead of the upper room, even though you're still in that upper room. So to solve this, the programmers did 2 things. First, they added some invisible, intangible floors here that belong to this upper room. That way, even if you're above the gap, your floor triangle is still a floor from this upper room, and so the upper room stays active. And second, a bit lower down, they added a second layer of invisible, intangible floors. These floors are intermediate floors, meaning they activate both the upper room and lower room. So when Mario falls into the gap, first the upper room is active, then both the upper room and lower room are active, and then only the lower room is active. So yeah, that's why these floors are here. And now let's resume the visual, which reveals that there are floor gaps. But this time, it's not ceiling or out of bounds that's below the floor gaps. Remember earlier, I said there were 3 cases for floor gaps. So far, we've only seen case 2, which is out of bounds, and case 3, which is a ceiling.
It actually
but now,
didn't
it's our first time
fuck
seeing
up.
case 1,
Impressive.
where there's a floor gap with a floor under it. So it's not actually an invisible wall, though it does stem from the same cause. So in our demonstration, that means each of these floor gaps has a floor under it, so I'll put blue points to represent that. And remember, these are floor gaps in the upper intangible floor. So when Mario goes above these floor gaps, his new floor is the lower intangible floor. So doing that causes the lower room to also activate and hides the objects in the upper room, like the Boo and red coin. So that's why out of nowhere, the Boo can just teleport back to its starting position while you're in this room. And finally, since it's a floor gap with a floor under it, we can just jump into it and fall down to the room below.
What? What the hell? Did anyone just see that?
Then in Hazy Maze Cave, we have this mesh ceiling that you're supposed to swing across. If you're not familiar with it, there's this path on the right that's just a dead end, there's this path in the middle that leads to an item block with a 1-up in it, and there's this path on the left that leads to the star. Now this one isn't actually an invisible wall, and it's not even a floor gap, it's a ceiling gap. Because remember, all the properties about floor detection also apply to ceilings, so they can have edge vertices that cause gaps too. And the reason these ceiling gaps matter is because if you're swinging across the mesh and move into a ceiling gap, then you fall off the mesh. So anyway, on this mesh structure, we have these 4 edge vertices that lie on this edge, we have this edge vertex that lies on this edge, and we have this edge vertex that lies on this edge. So first, let's look at the seam on the dead end path. Its edge vertex causes a ceiling overlap, which means that there's no problem here. So there's no risk of falling off if you explore the dead end. Then next, let's look at the seam at the start of the 1-up path. This one has 2 edge vertices, the right one causes a ceiling overlap, and the left one also causes a ceiling overlap. So this seam is also fine. Now let's look at the seam near the end of the 1-up path. Its edge vertex misses by causing a ceiling gap, meaning that there are ceiling gaps all along this seam. And I'm making them orange because we need a new color for ceiling gaps, and I'm kind of running out of colors here. Then next, let's look at the seam at the start of the star path. Just 1 edge vertex, which misses by causing a ceiling gap. So on this seam too, there are ceiling gaps that could make you fall off. Not very good, since this is the path to the star, like the one path you have to take. And finally, let's look at the seam near the end of the star path. Just 1 edge vertex again, and this one also causes a ceiling gap, which is extra not good because that means the path to the star has 2 seams of ceiling gaps, which like I said, can make you fall off out of nowhere. So in total, the mesh has 3 seams of ceiling gaps, 1 on the path to the 1-up and 2 on the path to the star. You know, this whole thing kind of feels like one of those carnival games that's secretly rigged against you. Like, they let you practice your swinging skills on the dead end to let you get the hang of it and build up your confidence. Cause there's no risk of falling off there, that one's perfectly safe. So then you try testing your skill on the 1-up path. There are no ceiling gaps near the beginning of it because they want to make you think you have a chance. But then right at the end is the trap to make you fall off. Here I hit a ceiling gap and fall down, but luckily I still land on the platform. And finally, if you want to go for the big prize, the star, well now it's double rigged against you. These first ceiling gaps are less dense on the right side, so that's the safer side to go on. And the second group of ceiling gaps is less dense on the left side, so that's what I recommend there. Though here, I still end up hitting it and falling down, which could easily lead to your death if you're not expecting it. And also, because these are ceiling gaps, that means it's possible to just jump right up into the gap, because the ceiling doesn't block you there. Here's what jumping into the gap looks like in the game. And just for good measure, I bonk in there to show that I'm surrounded by ceiling hitbox. Then in Lethal Lava Land, we have this arched platform. Its shape is like a breeding ground for edge vertices. Look at it, we have 7 of them. So let's see, we have a floor overlap, floor overlap, floor overlap, floor overlap, floor gap, floor gap, floor gap. So mainly on the right side, we have a bunch of unit columns of out of bounds that leak out. But we can't forget about the other side of the structure, because on this side, we have something very similar going on. 7 edge vertices. Looking at these ones, we have a floor overlap, floor overlap, floor overlap, floor overlap, floor gap, floor gap, floor gap. So it's actually the same pattern on this side that it was on the other side. But yeah, be careful if you're on this structure. And when Mario does a lava boost, he's able to reflect off of out of bounds, which means we can wedge Mario between unit columns to make him reflect every frame, just like earlier with the bonking. Then in the volcano and Lethal Lava Land, we have these floor triangles near the lava fall, which have an edge vertex between them. So this is a rare case when it involves a seam between floors without there being a wall on the seam. But we can analyze it just the same and see that the edge vertex causes a floor gap. So there's not even a wall over the floor gap this time, there's just nothing there. And that's why we get unit columns of out of bounds, which extend all the way up to near this upper path. So if you try to take a shortcut by jumping over the gap, you could just end up bonking on this invisible wall and falling down. And the cool thing about this one is that it's actually used in the A button challenge, you know, where your goal is to not press A. See, bouncing off the invisible wall helps you redirect your momentum when you're doing lava boosts up the lava fall, which lets you get all the way over to the star platform without having to press A at all. Then in Dire Docks, we have this wall near the 5 yellow coins. Based on the edges, it doesn't look like there should be any edge vertices here. It just looks like 2 edges that should laterally align. But what you don't see is that the floor on the bottom is bigger than you'd think and extends behind the wall. So really, the bottom edge looks like this, which means we have 2 edge vertices on the top. Now this one's weird because the edges are not at a weird angle, they're cardinally aligned, which means that it was completely doable to put these edge vertices exactly on the edge. But for whatever reason, they miss. And so we end up with a 2-unit thick continuous seam of invisible wall, which makes this one pretty egregious. Like, if you cross over this seam, you're very likely to hit this invisible wall, compared to the other ones we've seen whose units are more scattered. So you might bonk on it, you might try to jump up from the water onto the ledge and only manage to ledge grab, and you might try to run off this ledge and end up ledge grabbing instead. Because walking into an invisible wall slows down your speed, and walking near a ledge with too little speed makes you drop down into a ledge grab instead of just walking off the edge. Then in Snowman's Land, we have this wall. The top of the wall is subdivided into 2 different edges, so we have an edge vertex between them, and that edge vertex causes an invisible wall. And you can see that some of these unit columns only rise upwards until they meet the icy bridge. But anyway, I guess this invisible wall could actually help you if you were about to accidentally jump off, because then it could bonk you back on. Then another in Snowman's Land, we have this wall near the igloo, though 2 of these triangles are actually ceilings. So here are the edges, and here are the relevant edge vertices. Zooming in on them, we have a floor overlap on the left, and on the right, the vertices miss in a way that causes a floor gap. But just a little one with exactly 2 columns of out of bounds, and you can see that these columns only rise upwards until they meet the icy bridge. So it seems unlikely that anyone's ever hit these ones before, since there's just 2 of them and they're in such a weird spot next to this green wall. Also in Snowman's Land, we have these floor triangles on the snowman's head. Once again, this is a seam between floors with no wall in it, and the floors have an edge vertex that causes a floor gap. But do these floor gaps let through out of bounds or a ceiling? Well, why not both? See, farther down on the snowman, there's a ceiling that covers some of the floor gaps, but not all of them. So floor gaps to the northwest let out of bounds leak through, and floor gaps to the southeast let ceiling leak through. So it's like a hybrid invisible wall, half out of bounds, half ceiling, but 100% trouble, because one bonk on this could send you falling all the way down the snowman, and I mean all the way down. Then still in Snowman's Land, we have this wall near the moving snow mounds. It has 2 edge vertices on top because the wall is a trapezoid. The left edge vertex does a floor overlap, which is fine, but the right edge vertex does a floor gap, which is the problem. So all along the seam, there are unit columns of out of bounds. So if you're playing around near the snow mounds,
Ducky,
you
what's
might
up?
just bump into this invisible wall. Now there's something very interesting about this invisible wall, which has to do
Ad
with the snow
attack.
mounds. If we look at it from the side and take a sort of cross-section, you can see that each of the snow mounds actually drops down into the ground and covers the invisible wall for a split second before disappearing, and the extra big snow mound covers it a lot. So this is the only invisible wall where unit columns of out of bounds continuously appear and disappear. And because of that, we can actually have the out of bounds appear into Mario, causing him to die. You get it? Like normally, out of bounds prevents you from going into it, but we can go there when the out of bounds is gone and then it reappears into us. So basically, you can just die out of nowhere. And I should mention, if you go back into bounds, you can move around some more, but the death transition already started and so it'll still take you out of the level. Now you have to wonder, did anyone ever die like this in the history of the game? Surely it would take like 1,000 years before this ever happened to someone by chance,
huzzah.
right? Well, wonder no more, because it did happen to a guy named Bebop Bandit live on stream. So let's watch.
$5 for me.
Thank you for the.
of course I
Oh my
do.
gosh! Thank you for the sub.
Please. Please! For the love of f***ing God! What the hell? Are you f***ing
That is so
kidding me?
funny.
What the...
So it just goes to show, when you have so many people playing the game for so many years, crazy rare stuff will happen eventually. And finally in Snowman's Land, we have this wall belonging to the green slope. You know the drill, there's an edge vertex, it misses by causing a floor gap, and so there's unit columns of out of bounds all along the seam. Now you might think this one wouldn't be too bad, because who goes on that green slope? But actually, speedrunners climb over it as a shortcut, so it could definitely cause them to bonk and mess up their run, because now you're sliding all the way down into the water. Then near the top of Tall Tall Mountain, we have this little sliver of a wall. It has one edge vertex on the bottom, and if we look closely at it, we can see that it causes floor gaps. And these are the kind of floor gaps with a floor under them because the death barrier is below them. And so interestingly, we can actually just jump right into one of these floor gaps and go through the mountain. falling all the way down to the death barrier. And these floor gaps are actually used in the A button challenge. See, Mario's able to dive up that seam using the floor gaps, because each floor gap makes him become airborne, which lets him dive again even though he's on a steep floor. And diving straight up this seam is the fastest way to get to the star on top of the mountain. Then in Rainbow Ride, we have this wall on the ship. This one also doesn't look like it should have any edge vertices. It just looks like two edges that laterally align. But if we look at the surface triangle view, you can see that there are multiple floors here. And that's because the floors on the right trigger wind, like most of the ship does, whereas the floors on the left don't trigger wind, probably to let you get up to the star more easily. So because of that extra subdivision of triangles, now we have
I love
an
this
edge
stuff so
vertex on
much.
the bottom. That edge vertex causes a floor gap, so some unit columns of ceiling leak through, specifically from a ceiling on the bottom of the ship. So I don't know how often you're going to go right there, but if you do, you could hit this invisible wall. Then in the castle grounds, we have this wall above the steps in the moat. As you'll come to learn, steps are super prone to invisible walls, since each step adds another edge vertex. This one has two, so let's see. The left one causes a little gap, and the right one causes a huge gap. It's off by 6 units. It's like they weren't even trying to align it. And so the result of this is that we get an extra thick invisible wall. At least compared to the other ones we've seen so far. So yeah, you might hit this one if you try jumping into the moat. And good luck if you line up with the extra thick section. And also in the castle grounds, we have this wall near the bridge. Like I said, having steps is likely to cause invisible walls, and this is no exception. So this side of the bridge has some invisible walls. But there's also the other side of the bridge, which also has a wall above these steps. That also causes a bunch of edge vertices, some of which cause floor gaps to the right of the bridge. So on this side too, there are unit columns of out of bounds. So if you ever want to go from one side of the bridge to the other, maybe just walk on the bridge instead of jumping across the corners. You'll thank me later. And then inside the castle, we have the wall above the stairs down to the basement. With this many steps, we have more edge vertices than I know what to do with. Some cause gaps, some cause overlaps, you get the idea. You know, some part of me was like, there can't be invisible walls inside the castle. Like, this is the hub area, our safe haven. But nope, even the hub area can have invisible walls, especially with how many steps there are in the castle. Well, most of the castle steps are cardinally aligned, so they don't have any issues. But the sides of these steps are at a weird angle, which is the problem. So yeah, on both sides of these stairs, there are invisible walls that could get in your way. So watch out for those. Now remember, if you jump up into a ceiling, it cuts short your upwards trajectory and then you fall down. Also remember, if you jump up into out of bounds, the horizontal component of your quarter steps gets cancelled, but you still move vertically. Interestingly, the programmers made an oversight because they never considered what should happen if these two cases occurred together. And so, if you jump up into out of bounds with a ceiling above you, the out of bounds cancels the horizontal component of your movement and you still move vertically, completely ignoring the ceiling. In other words, the ceiling has no effect. You can just go straight up into the ceiling hitbox. Now this invisible wall is made of out of bounds and it extends up into the ceiling. So here, if we jump up into the invisible wall, it lets us pass straight through the ceiling, putting us next to the upstairs key door. This trick was actually used in the 120 star task, since it's the fastest way to go from the courtyard to upstairs. And the last example, in the Snowman's Land room, we have yet another staircase whose sides are at an angle. So lots of edge vertices, and some of them cause floor gaps. And so the result is that we get some unit columns of out of bounds. Not too many, just 8 of them, so watch out for those when you're making your way through this room. So yeah, that's the 4th cause of invisible walls, which we're gonna call floor gap due to misaligned edge vertex. And so now, let's look at the 5th cause. So remember that structure we had before, where it was just 2 steps? Let's look at it from above again. Remember, when this structure rotated, the 2 floor edges making up the seam stayed perfectly flush with no gaps between them. But now focus your attention on this vertex of the upper step. If we move this vertex to a slightly different spot, then the 2 floor edges aren't flush anymore. There's a gap between them. And if we do our little process, we can see that there are now floor gaps which could cause invisible walls. And geometry like this happens in the game. There are vertices that are meant to be aligned, but for whatever reason, they're a bit off. You know how the previous cause of invisible walls stemmed from a misaligned edge vertex? That one was at least understandable because the edge vertex had to have integer coordinates so it couldn't be placed exactly on the edge. But in this new case, there's really no excuse. The programmers literally just didn't line up two floor vertices that could have easily been lined up, causing there to be floor gaps. So let's look at some examples. In Cool Mountain, we have this wall near the beginning. Here are the floor edges, and we're going to focus on this vertex. So let's go to a top-down view, show the floors, and now zoom in. The vertex I highlighted should have been lined up with this other vertex, but instead of exactly coinciding, we have two vertices that are 1 unit apart, and all because the programmers didn't line them up right. So because of that, we have some gaps along the seam. And it's not a ceiling or out of bounds that's below these floor gaps, but another floor, specifically the death barrier. So the result of this is that we're able to jump into these floor gaps, assuming we do it at the corner where the wall is too small to push us away. And by going through this gap, we don't necessarily die, we can actually land all the way down here. That's why this technique is used in the 120 star tasks, because it's the fastest way to get to the wall kicks will work star. Then in Shifting Sandland, we have these two floors in the quicksand, which presumably share a vertex over here. But if we zoom in, we can see that their vertices are actually 5 units apart. That means all along the seam between those two triangles, there are unit columns of out of bounds. Not very good, because if you're riding the shell over that seam, then there's a chance your shell might break out of nowhere and you'll die.
Oh no.
Invisible.
Why does that man look like Mario?
And it could also mess up your flying, because if you fly into out of bounds, your angle gets redirected downwards. So you might be flying along and suddenly you're redirected downwards into the quicksand.
Keeb, what's up?
Pero man, ¿qué es este juego? ¿Por qué te estafa así?
Then in Wet Dry World, we have this wall that lies on a seam between floors. If we focus on the lower right vertex, we can see that it misses the upper right vertex by 1 unit. So all along the seam, there are units of out of bounds that leak out. And so when you're collecting that ring of 8 coins, you might accidentally bonk on this invisible wall. Then in Tall Mountain, we have this wall near the rolling log. We're gonna focus on this vertex on the right, but also there's an edge vertex on the left that we should also look at. So if we zoom in on them, we can see that the edge vertex misses by causing a floor gap, and for the other vertex we highlighted, it's off by where it should be by 1 unit. So all along the seam, unit columns of ceiling leak out from the ceiling on the underside of the structure. And hey, this is the invisible wall that I showed in the intro. Remember that? You were so innocent back then, you had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went. Then still in Tall Mountain, we have this wall triangle. Note that the triangle next to it is actually a floor and not a wall. And now we're gonna focus on this vertex. Zooming in on it, we can see that it's off by 1 unit, which means that all along the seam, there are floor gaps with floor under them because the death barrier is below here. And so it's actually possible to just fall right through one of those floor gaps and fall to the death barrier. Now this was the last main example of floor gaps with floor under them, aka the kind of floor gaps you can just jump into. But there are a few other examples that aren't as interesting because you can't jump all the way into them. But they're still worth mentioning, so let's briefly go through them. In Cool Mountain, there's some floor gaps at the start of this bridge, so whenever you walk over this seam, you could enter freefall for a split second if your movement happens to line up with a floor gap. And if you try to fall into one of these floor gaps, the wall pushes you out before you're all the way through. Also in Cool Mountain, there's some floor gaps in the wall kicks will work area at the start of this icy bridge. If you try to enter these, you get pushed to the side by the walls. In Snowman's Land, there are some floor gaps right where this walkway connects to the bully platform. If you try to enter these, you get pushed to the side by the wall. And in Tall Mountain, there are some floor gaps right near the Monty Moles. Like the others, if you try to enter these, you get pushed to the side by the wall. So yeah, I just wanted to point those out. And now back to the real examples. Lastly, in the castle grounds, we have these two walls near the waterfall. So this
You had a good
one's like
B-day?
a
That's
2-for-1
good.
special, because this vertex misses by a bit, and this vertex also misses by a bit. So all along the seam of both of these walls, we have unit columns of out of bounds that leak through. So if you want to be like Yoshi and jump into the waterfall, you'll have to hope you miss these invisible walls. So that's the 5th cause of invisible walls, which we're going to call floor gap due to misaligned vertices. And with that, it means we've done the left side of the Punnett square, which focused on floor edges failing to line up. Next, we're going to do the right side, which focuses on a floor edge and a ceiling edge failing to line up. You might get some deja vu as I explain it, because we're going to be going through a similar process to what we did before, but everything will be a little different. So, let's look at the sixth cause. So consider a box, just a regular old box. On the top there's a floor, on the bottom there's a ceiling, and on the sides there are walls. Now we're going to look at it from above on the unit grid. This time I'm going to draw the floor from the top of the box and the ceiling from the bottom of the box. Right now, the two rectangles exactly coincide, so it just looks purple. But I assure you, both a floor rectangle and a ceiling rectangle are being drawn. So this time, we're going to focus on the floor rectangle's south edge and the ceiling rectangle's south edge. Or in other words, the edge at the top of the wall versus the edge at the bottom of the wall. The question we're going to be analyzing is, do these two edges line up, or does one jut out more than the other? On the unit grid, we can see that these two edges have the same lateral coordinates, so they do line up. Now if we see any red area, then we know the ceiling is jutting out more. And if we see any blue area, then we know the floor is jutting out more. But if all we see is purple, then we know the floor edge and ceiling edge are exactly aligned. So let's put the structure back to a top-down view, and now let's rotate it. Still, the floor edge and the ceiling edge stay exactly in sync, so neither one juts out more. See, the two edges exactly match in terms of their lateral coordinates. So let's rotate the structure back to normal, and now we're gonna modify it. Now it's two steps going to the right. And you can see this change reflected on the unit grid, because now the floor is subdivided into two rectangles, while the ceiling is still just one rectangle. And if you notice, the floor now has two edge vertices, because these vertices are meant to lie exactly on the ceiling edges below. Now since the whole structure is cardinally aligned, it's easy for the edge vertices to lie exactly on their edges, and so no ceiling leaks through. On the 3D structure on the left, that means that this vertex exactly lines up with this edge. So let's clear all of that, put the structure back to a top-down view, and now let's rotate it again. You can see that now we run into the same issue from earlier because we have edge vertices at weird angles. For example, let's stop it here. At this angle, it's impossible for the edge vertex to lie in its edge, because the edge vertex has to be at integer coordinates, but the edge doesn't go through any integer coordinates. And so the edge vertex just has to pick integer coordinates that are close to the edge. In this case, the result is that the ceiling edge juts out a bit from the floor edge, because we can see some red area. Now if the edge vertex were here instead, then the floor would be jutting out because we can see some blue area. That would be fine, since it means the floor covers the entire ceiling and some extra. In fact, that's what's happening on the other side of the structure. But since the edge vertex is here, now we have an issue, because the ceiling juts out, which lets some ceiling leak through. To see this, we can do our little process. So first, we'll mark each integer point as either floor or ceiling. If it's both floor and ceiling, then I'm coloring it purple. Then add the arrows, and then fill in the unit squares. And so we can see that some of the unit squares are ceiling with no floor to cover them. Consequently, those ceiling units leak through the leaning wall and cause invisible walls. And so, any structure that resembles this structure could have the same problem. The floor could have the edge vertex, the ceiling could have the edge vertex, they could both have edge vertices. In fact, the structure could even look like this, or like this, or like this. Basically, it'll be a structure where on top there's a floor, on the bottom there's a ceiling, and on the side there are walls. Then you need the floor edges at the top of the wall and the ceiling edges at the bottom of the wall to be subdivided differently. That causes there to be edge vertices, which are intended to line up with an edge. But if the structure is at a weird angle, then the edge vertex might be misaligned from its edge, allowing some ceiling to leak through. So to recap, we looked at 4 scenarios: whether there was no edge vertex or there was an edge vertex, and whether the structure was cardinally aligned or at a weird angle. And only when there was an edge vertex at a weird angle did the ceiling jut out. So those are the 2 main ingredients. Now let's look at the situation from the side. So, consider the box again. Let's put it sideways and take the cross section of it. As we saw in the previous demonstration, there's some geometry that can cause these 2 points to be misaligned, meaning the wall triangle can end up slanted. So just like last time, we're going to look at 5 different alignments of the upper point. But this time, instead of checking whether 2 floors completely cover out of bounds, we're checking whether 1 floor completely covers a ceiling. So let's start with the wall being perfectly vertical. In this case, the edge of the floor is exactly flush with the edge of the ceiling. If we show the hitboxes, we can see that the floor completely covers the ceiling hitbox. And since none of the ceiling leaks through, it doesn't cause any invisible walls. So I'll give this case a happy face. Then next, let's look at leaning very far back. Here, the wall triangle is so slanted that it's now a ceiling. So that's an extra ceiling that the floor now needs to cover. But if we show the hitboxes, we can see that the floor does cover both ceilings completely. So this case gets a happy face. Then next, let's look at leaning a little back. Here, the wall triangle is still a wall, just a slightly leaning wall. If we show the hitboxes again, we can see that the floor still covers the whole ceiling, this time with a little bit of floor to spare. So this case gets a happy face. Then next, let's skip ahead and look at leaning very far forwards. Here, the wall triangle is so slanted the other way that it's now a floor. If we show the hitboxes, we can see that the two floors together cover all of the ceiling. Like, the original floor no longer covers the whole ceiling because its left edge is to the right of the ceiling's left edge. But fortunately, the new floor is there to pick up the slack and cover that part. So this case gets a happy face. And then finally, let's look at leaning a little forwards. Here, the wall triangle is still a wall, just a slightly leaning wall. Now let's show the hitboxes. You can see that in this case, some of the ceiling leaks through the leaning wall, because walls don't cover ceiling hitboxes. It's just like I said earlier, walls that lean slightly forwards are taking on the responsibility of a floor, but without the powers of a floor. So I'm gonna give this case an angry face. So to recap, we looked at 5 slants and only a wall that's leaning slightly forwards lets ceiling hitbox leak through. And if we move the upper vertex around continuously, you can see that it's only a very narrow range that lets the ceiling leak through. Specifically, the wall triangle has to be leaning forwards so that the ceiling juts out more than the floor, but the wall can't be leaning too far forwards or else it acts as a floor that covers that distance. And finally, let's look at the side view and the top-down view at the same time. When the wall leans very far back, the fill is just a uniform shade of purple, so no ceiling leaks. When the wall leans a little back, we see some blue, meaning the floor juts out more than the ceiling. But that doesn't cause any trouble. When the wall's perfectly vertical, it's also a uniform shade of purple, which is fine. When the wall leans a little forwards, now we see some red, meaning the ceiling juts out more than the floor, so some ceiling might be leaking through the leaning wall. And when the wall leans very far forwards, then the wall becomes a floor that covers the ceiling hitbox. So it's once again a uniform shade of purple, which is fine. And so, it's only the one case where ceiling leaks through. And let me clarify something. Last time, we looked at floor gaps, which actually had 3 different subcases. It could be a floor gap with a floor under it, a floor gap that lets out of bounds leak through, or a floor gap that lets ceiling leak through. But this time, there's just one case. When the ceiling juts out, ceiling leaks through. So I just wanted to clarify that bit of asymmetry. And so now, let's look at some examples. In Bob on Battlefield, we have this gray tunnel. Here's the wall, and you can see that the edges at the top and bottom of the wall are subdivided differently, which causes there to be edge vertices. So let's go to a top-down view, show the floors on the top of the tunnel, and you can see that on the underside of the tunnel, we have some ceilings. So let's add those to our map as well. Now we're gonna zoom in on each edge vertex. On all 4 of these edge vertices, you can see some red area, meaning the ceiling juts out more than the floor. And so the result is that all along this edge, there are ceiling units with no floor to cover them, resulting in an invisible wall. But we can't forget about the other side of the tunnel, because here we have something very similar going on. Another 4 edge vertices. But will the ceiling jut out or the floor jut out? Let's see. First the ceiling juts out, then the floor juts out, then the ceiling juts out, then the floor juts out. So interestingly, we actually end up with only 2 ceiling units of invisible wall, one at each of the 2 vertices where the ceiling jutted out. So that's a cool thing about this type of invisible wall. Sometimes there will just be a single unit column sticking out right at the ceiling vertex itself. And now I'll show you another cool thing you can do with invisible walls, walking in midair, then down warping. So how does that work? Well, let me explain. So as you know, Mario's movement consists of him moving using quarter steps. Now, the quarter step function in the code has a return value. You can basically think of the return value as the status for how the quarter step went. In total, there are 4 possible values that can be returned. First, the movement succeeded. This is basically the default value and means nothing unexpected happened. Second, Mario became airborne. This happens when you leave the ground. Third, the movement got cancelled, either because Mario moved into a ceiling or out of bounds. And fourth, Mario hit a wall, which happens when Mario hits a wall. Now the quarter step function can only return one of these values, so even if it seems like multiple things happened, the function just has to pick one and return it. So for example, let's say we have a setup like this and Mario does a quarter step. This quarter step both leaves the ground and moves into a ceiling that cancels the step. The function can't return both that Mario became airborne and the movement got cancelled, so it just has to pick one. And in this case, it picks that the movement got cancelled. That one takes priority. So what happens here is that the movement gets cancelled and Mario ends up pushing in place. He does not become airborne. Here's what that looks like in the game. Mario's movement gets cancelled even though the quarter step goes off the edge. But now consider this. Let's say Mario's walking into a ceiling and then suddenly the floor moves out from under him. You'd think he would fall down, but that's not what happens. He's actually able to stay in the air walking into the ceiling. See, the normal way that the game realizes that Mario's airborne is by checking the return value of the quarter step function and seeing if it's the airborne option. But as we just established, if Mario walks into a ceiling and the air at the same time, then the quarter step function just returns that the movement got cancelled, not that Mario became airborne. So at no point does the game realize that Mario should become airborne, and instead he's just allowed to continue moving into the ceiling in midair. An easy place to see this is on this elevator in Big Boo's Haunt. We can walk into the ceiling next to the elevator, and then Mario stays in place pushing even as the elevator moves away. Now when you're in this state, there are a few things you can do. You can press A to jump out of it, you can press B to punch in place, and you can press Z, which downwarps you to the ground while crouching. Why does it downwarp you? Well, when you press Z while you're moving, you go into the crouch sliding action. Now an interesting thing about the sliding actions is that they tilt Mario based on the floors around him. See, even though Mario's on a flat floor, the sliding action causes him to tilt based on that hill next to him. Here's the function in the code responsible for setting that tilt. But you can see that the first thing this function does is set Mario's height to be at the height of the floor below him. So that means every time you slide and get your tilt set, you're also being snapped to the floor below you. More specifically, this floor snap happens on every frame except if your last quarter step became airborne. You know, because they didn't want you to get a big downwarp when you slide off the edge. So let's say you're in midair and you're walking into a ceiling. Then you press Z to crouch slide into the ceiling. The first quarter step of the crouch slide enters the ceiling hitbox and gets cancelled. So the return value of that quarter step is that it got cancelled, not that it became airborne. And like I said, any sliding movement that doesn't become airborne aligns Mario with the ground, and so he gets a big downwarp to the floor below him. So that's how the downwarp works in Big Boo's Haunt. So this mostly explains how I downwarped earlier. I walked into a ceiling in midair and then pressed Z. But how did I initiate walking in midair without standing on a platform that moves out from under me? Well, it has to do with the turning around action. See, when Mario starts turning around, he goes into the turning around action. Then a bit later, it transitions into the walking action. You know, because he finished turning around. Here's the code for the turning around action, and here's the relevant logic. So if Mario's done turning around, specifically if the turning around animation is completed, then Mario goes into the walking action. Now a bit earlier, we have some other important code. This one says, if the quarter steps result in becoming airborne, then Mario goes into the free fall action. So you can see the issue. Let's say on the same frame, Mario both leaves the ground and finishes turning around. Then first his action gets set to free fall, and then second his action gets set to walking. So that first action change gets overridden by the second action change. And so even though Mario left the ground, he still ends up in the walking action. Now this exploit by itself just results in one frame of walking in the air before transitioning to freefall on the next frame. But let's say we use that one frame of walking in the air to walk into out of bounds. Now Mario stays walking in midair and can downwarp by pressing Z. We can also use that one frame of walking in the air to walk into a ceiling, which also lets us downwarp. Now since invisible walls are made of out of bounds and ceilings, we can also do the trick on them, by walking in midair and then pressing Z to downwarp. So let me summarize everything. I did a turnaround and then walked off the edge on the same frame that the turnaround ended. That first set my action to freefall, but then overrode it with the walking action. So I was in midair, but still in the walking action. Then I walked into the invisible wall, so the quarter step return value was that the quarter step got cancelled, not that I left the ground. Because of that, the game didn't know that I should have become airborne, and so it just let me walk in midair. And finally, I pressed Z to downwarp because the crouch sliding action aligns Mario with his floor if it doesn't become airborne. And here, it didn't become airborne, it got cancelled, because I crouch slid into the invisible wall. So a lot going on there, but that's how you can down warp on basically any invisible wall. Then still in Bob on Battlefield, we have this wall on the mountain. This is the wall with the lower alcove. Now, there's one triangle on the wall that's actually classified as a ceiling. So, let's mark that ceiling's edges as well. So that gives us 4 edge vertices. And as you can see, all 4 of them have the ceiling jut out more than the floor. So that means both on the ceiling of the alcove and along that little extra ceiling, we have ceiling columns leaking through. Luckily, none of them block the entrance of the alcove itself. But if you're on top of the mountain, you could hit this invisible wall if you try to cross above this edge.
Alright, so now,
right above that previous wall,
all we have to do
have
is
this wall on the mountain. This is the wall with the upper alcove, which if you remember, already had an invisible wall in it. But anyway, we have 4 edge vertices on the ceiling of the alcove. So let's see. Floor juts out, ceiling juts out, ceiling juts out. So basically, just on the right side of the alcove ceiling, we have some ceiling columns leaking through. So you could hit these if you try to travel above the alcove. Now, speedrunners actually come out of that upper alcove and side flip up to King Bob-omb, potentially going right through the invisible wall. So if you ever try that side flip and you only manage to ledge grab, you probably got blocked by that invisible wall. Then in Jolly Roger Bay, we have this wall on the sunken ship. The wall is a diamond shape, so it has 2 edge vertices, one at the top corner and one at the bottom corner. You can see that both edge vertices let the ceiling jut out, and it juts out by a lot. So once again, we have a really thick invisible wall. Now this is our first invisible wall that stems from surface triangles on an object, because the sunken ship is an object and not just static geometry. And the thing about objects is that they're only tangible when Mario's within a certain radius around them. For example, if you're standing on an object and you jump up too high, you may notice your shadow change positions. That's because when you jump up too high, you move out of the object's tangibility radius, and so the object stops being tangible. In other words, the object stops loading its surface triangles, and so your shadow drops from on top of the object to just on top of the ground.
because there's no vertices right next to the sleeves here. I'm
sunken
gonna add those
ship.
really quick.
The invisible walls here stem from the ship's ceiling triangles. In other words, these invisible walls only exist when the ship's surface triangles are loaded, and that only happens when Mario is within this radius around the ship. So if Mario's outside of that radius, the ship won't have any surface triangles, and so effectively, there are no invisible walls outside of the radius. And so going forward, all invisible walls stemming from object triangles will have their height capped at the object's tangibility radius. So here, you can see that if we swim above the invisible wall, nothing happens, since the ship is intangible when we're this far away from it. But if we swim a little lower down into the invisible wall, then the ceiling triangles are loaded and affect Mario, causing him to downwarp. Because remember, when you're in water, ceiling hitboxes downwarp you to the bottom of their hitbox.
What just happened? What just happened?
Then in
I just had a thought.
We have this.
I just had a thought. I just realized. So there's a bounty on something in here, let me hang on. Okay. Okay, I might have to like rewatch the video on this. But the same person, I didn't realize it was the same person that did the invisible wall video. They basically did this upwarp. Somebody found an upwarp in TikTok clock, and they weren't able to recreate it. So there's like $1,000 bounty on it. I wonder if it's just like, I wonder if it's literally just invisible walls or something that's causing it. I don't know. Anyways.
Wall on the side of this snowy bridge, it's just a triangle, so it has one edge vertex on the bottom. If we zoom in, you can see that the ceiling juts out, meaning we have ceiling columns all along this edge. And I really like the way this one looks. It's very aesthetically pleasing. But anyway, if you're sliding down this path, be wary of jumping off to the right side here. Then still in Cool Mountain, we have this wall near the wall kicks will work area. It has one
Oh,
edge
it's not
vertex
working
on
still.
the
What
top.
the hell?
And
Oh,
when
it's
we
'cause I-
zoom in, you can see that
I
the
forgot to
ceiling
parent it,
juts
that's
out.
why.
So we have a decently thick invisible wall, which thins out farther away from the ledge. Now you might think, who would ever run into this invisible wall? Like, you're not just gonna jump off the edge right there, right? Well, not exactly. You
Okay.
see, speedrunners
I'm
jump
gonna
down
have to
that
clean
way
up
to
a
get to
little
the
bit.
wall kicks will work star. So let's take a look at some past attempts.
Oh my god, that's what? How am I standing here? Oh. Mario?
What the fuck? Oh my. Oh my.
Oh no.
So what's going on with those? Mario's doing some weird animations.
I shouldn't have joined
Well,
all
let
of
me
those. I
explain.
should have waited.
Firstly,
Oh well.
when Mario's on a steep floor, he slides down. You can even slide into ceilings and out of bounds, in which case your movement gets cancelled and you just stay sliding in place. And note that when you're sliding, you can use the control stick to tilt Mario's upper body. Now usually when you're in a sliding action, your animation updates every frame to be the sliding animation. But there's an oversight in the sliding code, because if you're sliding and your movement gets cancelled, either from moving into a ceiling or out of bounds, then Mario's animation doesn't get set to the sliding animation. Instead, you just keep whatever animation you are already in. I mean here, I was already in the sliding animation when I started sliding into out of bounds, so I kept that sliding animation. But let me demonstrate it with a different animation. Here, I do the pushing animation and then start sliding into out of bounds. The sliding into out of bounds doesn't update Mario's animation, and so his animation stays as pushing, even though he's actually sliding. And when you're in this state, you can still use the control stick to tilt Mario's upper body. So going back to Cool Mountain, you can see that the invisible wall here is right next to a steep floor that makes you slide. So we can use the invisible wall to let us slide in place with various other animations. For example, here I slide in place in the backflipping animation. So it doesn't even look like Mario landed yet, even though he's actually on the ground sliding. Here I slide in the jumping animation, and remember, I can still tilt Mario's upper body, which looks pretty funny in this animation. It definitely wasn't intended to handle that. Here I slide in the walking animation. This one also looks pretty silly when you tilt him, especially because he's just running in place. Where are you trying to get to, Mario? You trying to go somewhere? Oh, almost got there. Come on, Mario, you can do it. Oh, almost there. Come on, a little more. Oh, there we go. Here I do a triple jump into it, so I slide in the triple jump animation. And here I slide in the sparkly triple jump animation, which results in Mario somersaulting for forever. So yeah, it's fun to play around with. Then in Hazy Maze Cave, we have this wall on this little floating structure. It has two edge vertices on the bottom. So will the floor jut out or the ceiling jut out? On this first vertex, actually neither one juts out. They're exactly aligned. So give it up for the programmers, guys. They made an edge vertex that exactly lies on its edge. No one thought it could be done, but here we are. Well, to be fair, this edge is at a 45-degree angle, so not exactly a weird angle. And then for the other edge vertex, the ceiling juts out. So actually, that results in just one ceiling column of invisible wall, right at the vertex itself. But then there's also the other side of the structure, which is like a mirror image of the first side. So we have two edge vertices, one of them lines up exactly, and the other one lets the ceiling jut out. So on this side too, we have another ceiling column all by itself. So I actually don't know if anyone's ever hit these ones before, given how little area they cover. Then in Lethal Lava Land, we have this wall at the start of the walkway. There's one edge vertex at the bottom. Now the edge vertex misses its edge, but it's interesting, because to the left, this causes a floor gap with out of bounds units, and to the right, this causes the ceiling to jut out with ceiling units. So it's once again a hybrid invisible wall, with some out of bounds and some ceiling. So be careful when you jump onto the start of this path, because you will get burned if you mess up. Then in Snowman's Land, we have this wall on the ledge with the tree. It has one edge vertex on the bottom. Now this one's also a hybrid in a sense, because on the left we have a floor gap with ceiling leaking through, and on the right we have the ceiling jutting out more than the floor does. So that means all along this edge there are ceiling columns leaking through. So if you're ever climbing up the snowman and then you randomly have your height cut short or bonk while you're crossing this edge, now you know why. Then still in Snowman's Land, we have this section near the top of the snowman. This one's a little weird because it doesn't involve a wall. Instead, to the left we have a ceiling, so let's mark the ceiling's edge, and to the right we have a floor, so let's mark the floor's edge. And so basically, the edge vertex is here because the floor vertex is meant to lie on the ceiling's edge. Now the edge vertex misses, which means that farther to the right, we have the ceiling jutting out more than the floor. And so all along this edge, we have some invisible wall from the ceiling leaking through. This one could get in your way if you try cutting across the corner while climbing the snowman. But also, this invisible wall is next to a floor so steep that you can't stand on it or slide on it. You just fall off of it. So a cool thing you can do is wedge Mario between the floor and the invisible wall, and he just kind of gets stuck there in the falling animation. But it is possible to get out of it.
Yes, no. What is going on? What? I've never seen that. What?
Then in Tall Tall Mountain, we have this wall near the rolling log. See, there's a reason I picked this place to use for the intro, and it's because there's so many invisible walls around here that I figured the most people would relate to bumping into one of them. Then we also have one on this wall, which includes that part on the left without a wall. We actually have two different edge vertices here, which both miss the edge. So that means to the left, we have some invisible wall from the ceiling jutting out. And then on the other side of the log, we also have something going on. Two edge vertices. The right edge vertex lets the floor jut out, which is okay, but the left edge vertex misses in a way that both makes a floor gap with ceiling units and also lets the ceiling jut out. So yet another hybrid case. So yeah, this area is even more hazardous than you would think, with 3 more invisible walls that you have to worry about. And there's actually one more invisible wall that's around here, but we're not gonna get around to that one until a bit later, so stay tuned for that.
Abandon the casino. What the fuck was that? I'm pretty sure that was an invis wall.
What? Oh my god.
Then still in Tall Tall Mountain, at the top of the waterfall, we have these 2 walls. It's another alcove, and alcoves seem to be basically as bad as stairs are. But anyway, we have 2 edge vertices, and they both let the ceiling jut out. So along both ceiling edges, we have some invisible wall, though it's much more concentrated on the left side than it is on the right side. So basically, if you try to enter the alcove from above, you might get blocked by this invisible wall. Then in the Tall Tall Mountain slide, we have the first arch. Remember when I said the first arch was fine because it had a floor on top, unlike the second and third arches? Well, turns out it does have some invisible walls. We just weren't ready for them back then. But you can see that its shape creates a ton of edge vertices, so it's almost guaranteed that some of them will let ceiling leak out. And then there's also the other side of the arch. There's not actually a wall on this side, but I'm still drawing a theoretical wall just to help you see the shape of the arch. So on this side too, we have a bunch of edge vertices, some of which let ceiling leak through. And the invisible wall on this side is basically a mirror image of the invisible wall on the other side. So while you can go on top of the first arch, unlike the second and third arches, there are still some invisible walls to worry about. Then in the huge version of Tiny Huge Islands, we have this wall, one edge vertex at the bottom, which lets ceiling jut out, so we have some invisible wall to the right of the edge vertex. But we're actually not done yet, because on this wall too, we have something going on. 2 more edge vertices that both let ceiling jut out, so we have some invisible wall on this edge too. So I guess if you ever wanted to just jump off one of these 2 edges, then these invisible walls could get in your way. Or just think of them as guardrails keeping you on for your own safety. And then in the tiny version of Tiny Huge Island, we have basically the same thing. Well, only for the first invisible wall. The second invisible wall actually isn't present at all here. But for this one, it's just one more invisible wall that you have to worry about. Then in Tick Tock Clock, we have this wall on, you guessed it, more stairs. So that's 3 edge vertices, the outer 2 line up exactly, but the middle one lets the ceiling jut out. So just near that middle vertex, we have some invisible wall, specifically on the first and second steps. But then we also have the other side of the stairs. Note that the wall on this side doesn't include the upper 2 steps, because the wall for those 2 steps is a bit further out in order to be flush with the treadmill. But that means we just have 2 edge vertices, one of them lines up exactly, and the other one lets the ceiling jut out. So on this side of the stairs, we have some invisible wall just on the first step. And so these invisible walls are pretty bad, because they might kill you on the very first jump in the level, only a couple seconds in.
For the one time, Mario, don't die.
Walls absolutely everywhere. Like, literally, go f yourself.
And since Tick-Tock Clock is a vertical stage, that means invisible walls here have a much greater impact, because now the invisible wall can affect you at later parts of the level too. This invisible wall goes all the way up until it meets this walkway. But more importantly, it's right in the middle of this gap you have to jump over, where sometimes it gets cut off a bit by this rotating triangle. But that means anytime you jump over this gap, you have to worry about this invisible wall. And bonking in Tick-Tock Clock usually leads to falling way far down, often with dire consequences. So it's pretty unfortunate for speedrunners, but that's just the way it is.
Oh, my cock, dude.
And speedrunners will also try to jump from this cog to the get a hand star, which goes right through this invisible wall. So you could easily bonk during that jump too.
Alright, so I can do it here and there's no invis.
Ha!
What? What? Okay. I don't have any words for that invisible wall. I've never seen that.
I think I'm done. I think I'm actually done. I mean, there's no like Vizims on it, but I don't think they need any. Well, okay, hang on. Let me send them a message really quick.
Oh my god, invis wall, really? Oh my god, another invis wall!
Then in that same area, we have this wall on the treadmill. Because of the way the floor slopes down on both sides, we get two edge vertices. The left one has the floor jut out, and the right one has the ceiling jut out. So primarily on the right side, we get some invisible walls. But not above the last two stairs, because they connect to the treadmill and block the invisible wall from coming out. Now luckily, this invisible wall doesn't extend up too high since it's from an object, but it can still lead to your death if you hit it just right. Then still in Tick-Tock Clock, we have this wall on the pit in the pendulums area. Kind of a weird shape, but it has three edge vertices. So let's see. First the ceiling juts out, then they're exactly aligned, then the ceiling juts out. Consequently, we have ceiling columns all along the edge. Though you may notice that there's a single gap in the invisible wall, which is right at the vertex that was exactly aligned. But basically, that means that anytime you jump over to this area, you risk bonking and falling all the way down to your death. So definitely not a very fair system.
That scream!
Why is there an invisible wall there?
Hey, now you know why. Now this invisible wall also extends pretty high up in the level. You can see some of it stops at this walkway, but then the rest of it rises up all the way to the ceiling of the course. So yeah, this one can be pretty annoying given how far reaching it is in the level. Specifically, it passes by two walkways. For this lower walkway, if you try to take a shortcut by jumping across the gap, you may bonk and fall down to your death.
Wait a minute, did I forget? I might have forgotten something.
That is the saddest thing.
I did. I forgot the back teeth there. No! But that's okay, that can be redone really fast.
Clearly, this is not the run. Clearly, Jesus.
And for the upper walkway, if you try to jump down, as speedrunners do, you could definitely hit the invisible wall.
I'll be back.
Oula, je vais juste aller sur l'aiguille histoire d'éviter les murs invisibles.
Wow.
Someone help me, man. Jesus fucking Christ.
But this one actually has a solution. See, you can go forwards on top of the clock hand because it creates a little safe haven above it. It's like Moses parting the Red Sea, but it's the clock hand parting the invisible wall. Then even still in TikTok Clock, we have these 3 treadmills. Now the treadmills themselves are cardinally aligned, so there's no issue with them. But focus your attention on these mesh walls between the treadmills. These walls are actually both sides of 2 little boxes. So if we look at them, you can see that they're 3D shapes. It's just that normally you only see the texture for one side of them. Now on the bottom of these boxes, we have ceilings. So the question is, do the ceiling hitboxes leak out? Well, you see, the boxes don't have floors on their tops. Instead, they rely solely on the treadmill floors to cover them. So let's see how well that plays out. For this first seam, there's a 1 unit wide gap between the treadmills. Consequently, we see some red area, so you might think some ceiling leaks through. But actually, every integer coordinate is covered by a floor, so all the ceiling is covered. Now let's take a look at the other seam. Between these 2 treadmills, there's a 2 unit wide gap. So this time, we do have integer coordinates that are ceiling with no floor to cover them. This gives us a 1 unit thick, continuous seam of invisible wall between those 2 treadmills. And so as you're climbing from the 2nd treadmill to the 3rd treadmill, you might hit this invisible wall. But that's not actually the full story here. Remember what I said, the boxes have ceilings on the bottom, but no floors on the top, so they rely on the treadmill floors to cover the ceilings. But the treadmills are objects, meaning that they're only tangible when Mario's near them. So it probably wasn't a very good idea to cover the ceilings with floors that are only sometimes there. I'll illustrate what I mean with a diagram. So here are the 3 treadmills, here's the upper box, and here's the lower box. Now we're actually going to subdivide both boxes into 2 chunks. So both boxes have a right chunk and a left chunk. Next, let's add the ceilings on the bottom of the boxes. Now we're going to go through the 4 chunks to see what each of their ceiling hitboxes look like. So first let's do the right chunk of the lower box. In isolation, its ceiling hitbox looks like this, but this chunk is covered by the lower treadmill. So if Mario's within this radius around the treadmill, then the treadmill will have its floors to cover the ceiling, so there's no invisible wall within that radius. But the invisible wall is there when Mario's outside of the radius. Then next, let's look at the left chunk of the lower box. In isolation, its ceiling hitbox looks like this, but this chunk is covered by the middle treadmill. So if Mario's within this radius, then the treadmill has its floors, and so there's no invisible wall within that radius, but it is there outside of the radius. Then next, let's look at the right chunk of the upper box. This one's not covered by any treadmill, so the full ceiling hitbox is exposed. And finally, let's look at the left chunk of the upper box. In isolation, its ceiling hitbox looks like this, but this chunk is covered by the upper treadmill. So if Mario's within this radius, then the treadmill has its floors, and so there's no invisible wall within that radius, but it is there outside of the radius. And so now you can see the true nature of these invisible walls. Specifically, we have 4 separate chunks of invisible wall. One of them is fully exposed, and the other 3 exist only outside of the tangibility radius of the corresponding treadmill. Now I'll show what these invisible walls look like in the game. So we have the right chunk of the lower box, the left chunk of the lower box, the right chunk of the upper box, and the left chunk of the upper box. So yeah, this is the true nature of these invisible walls. So you can see that the lower invisible walls rise up into the walkway, while the upper invisible walls rise up all the way to the ceiling of the course. So even between the first and second treadmill, there's still the possibility of bonking if you jump up high enough. And because the upper invisible wall rises all the way to the top, it can get in your way if you try to long jump from the clock hand over to the thwomp. And remember, it's not just a single seam of invisible wall, it's a whole box area's worth. So there's really no chance of you getting lucky and passing right through it, like you could with many of the other invisible walls. And then one more in TikTok Clock, we have this wall on the uppermost treadmill. Just like the first treadmill, it has 2 edge vertices on the top. When we zoom in, you can see that the right one lets the ceiling jut out, and the left one is exactly aligned. So just on this side of the treadmill, we have some invisible wall. And remember, because these invisible wall units stem from an object, I cap their height at the object's tangibility radius. And so even at the very top of TikTok Clock, there's this final invisible wall to worry about. Then in Rainbow Ride, we're back to the ship. We have this wall on the ship's outside, which has 1 edge vertex on the bottom. Zooming in, you can see that the edge vertex misses by 2 units even though the edge was cardinally aligned. So the invisible wall is 2 units thick right at the edge vertex, and everywhere else it's a 1 unit thick continuous seam. And so if you try long jumping onto that part of the ship, this invisible wall could lead to your death. Then in Vantage Cap under the moat, on the uppermost platform, we have this wall. It has 1 edge vertex on the bottom. Now this one's another hybrid, because to the right, we have the ceiling jut out more than the floor, and to the left, we have a floor gap that lets out of bounds leak through. So we end up with some out of bounds and some ceiling, both stemming from the same misaligned edge vertex. But then we have something similar going on the second platform. And by similar, I mean exactly the same thing, because this edge vertex also causes a hybrid invisible wall, with some out of bounds and some ceiling. But we're not done yet, because the third platform also has a hybrid invisible wall, but this time on the other side of the platform. So you might be wondering just how many of these platforms are going to have invisible walls. Well, we're on the 4th platform right now, and there are only 7 platforms total, so why don't you take a guess at how many of them have invisible walls? Right now we're seeing the 5th platform's invisible wall, and the 6th platform also has an invisible wall. So we're 6 for 6, place your bets for the last one. And the 7th platform also has an invisible wall, this time on the other side again. Can you believe that? That means all 7 platforms have invisible walls on them. Look at that. Look at what you have to go through every time you traverse this area. A whole gauntlet of invisible walls. So you thought the challenge was just to make your way down some platforms while collecting the red coins. But nope, there's an additional secret challenge, which is to hope you get lucky on every platform's invisible wall. And speedrunners will do a triple jump on the 7th platform in order to get onto the railing, which goes right through that last invisible wall.
I got invis-walled. Oh, no. What?
Mm-hmm. What the? Okay. What?
Temporary invisible wall.
Oh, okay. Yeah, alright. Moving right along.
And then finally, we have this wall in the castle foyer. Factoring in the hole for the door, it has 3 edge vertices. Zooming in, we have exactly aligned, and ceiling juts out. So that means mainly on the right side of the door opening, we have ceiling leaking through. So you might just be going through the foyer to your next course, and then bam, you hit this invisible wall. So not even the foyer is safe. So that's the 6th cause of invisible walls, which we're gonna call ceiling juts out due to misaligned edge vertex. And so now, let's look at the 7th cause. So remember that structure we had before, where it was just a regular old box? Let's look at it from above again. Remember, when this structure rotated, the floor edge and ceiling edge stayed perfectly flush without letting any ceiling leak through. But now focus your attention on this vertex of the ceiling. If we move this vertex to a slightly different spot, then it can make the ceiling jut out. And if we do our little process, we can see that some units are ceiling with no floor to cover them. And so those ceiling units leak through the leaning wall and cause invisible walls. So once again, there are cases where the programmers literally just didn't line up 2 vertices that could have been lined up. In this case, it's a floor vertex and a ceiling vertex that aren't lined up, allowing some ceiling to leak through. So let's look at some examples. In Bob on Battlefield, we have these 2 walls on the mountain, on the ridge with the spinning heart. Based on their edges, they connect at this vertex. So will the floor vertex and ceiling vertex line up? Nope. The ceiling vertex misses by 1 unit and causes ceiling to jut out on both walls. So we end up with invisible wall on both of these edges. So this is just one more invisible wall on the mountain that you have to worry about. Then in One's Fortress, we have this wall on the axle connected to the rotating elevators. Note that the axle is shaped like a triangular prism. We can see that the floor vertex and ceiling vertex are 1 unit off, so the ceiling juts out on this edge. Though it only results in 3 units of ceiling leaking through. But nevertheless, it's still a potential thing that can make you bonk out of nowhere as you play this level. Then in Cool Mountain, we have this wall in the wall kicks will work area. This time, the floor vertex and ceiling vertex miss by quite a bit, and so all along this wall, we end up with ceiling units leaking through. And so this is the second invisible wall that we've seen near the wall kicks will work area. And remember, speedrunners go through that spot as they make their way to the star, so it's extra bad for speedrunners.
What? What's that?
Can you see that? The invisible wall? Wow. I never seen this. Wow.
Then in Snowman's Land, we have this wall on the snowman. And let's also mark this floor edge next to it, because that also connects to the vertex we're about to look at. Zooming in, you can see that the floor vertex misses the ceiling vertex by 1 unit. So on the left, we have a floor gap with ceiling coming out, and on the right, we have the ceiling jutting out more than the floor. So another hybrid case. And earlier, we had another invisible wall right around here. So I guess this part of the snowman wasn't put together too well. Then in Tall Tall Mountain, on the mushroom near the start, we have these 4 walls. Based on their edges, that gives us 5 vertices to examine. So let's see. Floor juts out, ceiling juts out, exactly aligned, ceiling juts out, and both floor and ceiling jut out in different directions. That means along all 4 of these edges on the mushroom, the ceiling juts out and causes invisible walls. So anytime you jump onto the starting mushroom, you might bonk and die. Though on the bright side, you don't actually need to go onto that mushroom for anything. But what if it affected a mushroom that was a lot more important, like the lonely mushroom? Because on this mushroom too, we also have 4 relevant walls. When we look at these vertices, we see something very similar, with the vertices missing each other. That gives us invisible walls along these 4 edges too. And this one's even worse, because this is a mushroom that you have to go to, and so you might bonk out of nowhere and die as you're trying to get the star on it. But we're not done yet, because there's one more mushroom we have to do, and that's the mushroom with the red coin star on it. You know, I'm starting to suspect that they just copy and pasted these mushrooms, which would explain why all 3 of them have such similar mistakes in terms of not lining up their vertices quite right. But yeah, that means that this mushroom also has 4 edges worth of invisible wall, so you could easily hit this and die as you're jumping to the red coin star. And don't count on the winds to save you.
What? No. What the? What the? Nah. What? What do you? What? What the? What do you want me to do? What? Nah. No. I refuse to believe that. Just. Come on. You look like the NPC version of Mark Ruffalo. Just get. What is going on? What is going on? So anyway, how are you guys doing today? Pretty good, or how's work? How's school?
And just the other day, Liam was on a world record pace run and lost the run to this invisible wall.
Rounds up to fucking 13.
Mulch coded.
I don't deserve it. Why does this only happen to me? Why do I only get the worst invis walls in all of my runs? Why do I consistently get the worst coin RNG? The worst luck at all? In every run? Keep going? Dude, I'm gonna die. I was like playing fine, man. Like I was playing fine. I would have saved time, man. Oh my god, man.
So to avoid hitting this invisible wall during a speedrun, you just have to aim more to the right. Specifically, make sure you cross onto the mushroom to the right of this vertex that I'm highlighting here. If you do that, then you will avoid the invisible wall. Then in Tower of the Wingcap, we have this wall on the side of the rook. This wall has 2 edge vertices, but we're also going to look at this vertex on the far left. So let's see what we got. Ceiling juts out, floor juts out, and then this vertex misses by 2 units, causing the ceiling to jut out. So all along this edge, we end up with invisible wall from the ceiling leaking out. But we're not done yet, because we also have to look at this wall on the rook. Once again, we have 2 edge vertices and another vertex to look at. This time, we have ceiling juts out, floor juts out, and this vertex misses by 2 units. So it's the exact same thing on this side, which makes me wonder if this was copy and pasted too. And we're still not done, because we have one more thing to look at, and I literally mean one more. Because on this vertex, if we zoom in, you can see that the floor vertex misses the ceiling vertex, and it results in just 1 unit of ceiling leaking out. So in total, we have 2 edges of invisible wall, which are symmetric to each other, and a separate single unit of invisible wall in a different corner. But it's not jumping into these invisible walls that you should be worried about, but flying into them. Because remember what I said, flying into an invisible wall redirects you downwards. So you might be trying to fly onto the rook and then mysteriously get redirected downwards, bonk, and fall down.
Alright, down. It's gotta be, this has to be aggressive. Okay, so, somebody explain, when you land on something, why aren't you sliding?
Then in Bowser in the Fire Sea, we have some stuff going on this springy staircase. So for this ramp, if we take a look at the floor on top of the ramp and the ceiling on the bottom of the ramp, we can see that they're offset by about 20 units. So basically, the floor is in the right position, but the whole ceiling is just 20 units to the side of where it should be, which results in some invisible wall. And then actually, we have something very similar going on this ramp. Because if we look at the floor and ceiling here, we can see that the ceiling is also about 20 units off of where it should be. And right in this spot, that causes a huge chunk of ceiling to leak out, like a whole rectangle's worth. And then there's also invisible wall along the rest of the edge. And you can see that some of the unit columns rise up into the walkway above. Also, the bottom of these unit columns move up and down because the whole staircase moves up and down. So as you're climbing your way up this staircase, just be wary of bumping into those invisible walls.
What the fuck was that, dude? Holy shit.
But there's also a cool thing you can do with these invisible walls. We can walk into them and then the staircase moves away, resulting in Mario walking in midair. Like we discussed earlier, this is because every quarter step returns that it got cancelled instead of that it went airborne. So the game never realizes that Mario left the ground and just lets him walk in midair. Let's watch as one speedrunner discovers this trick all on their own.
The worst down angle anyone has. What the hell? I didn't know you could do this. What? What? What is that? What? What is happening? What is happening? Dude, I did not know. What the fuck?
Then still in Bowser in the Fire Sea, we have this wall on the walkway, and we're gonna focus on this vertex. When we zoom in, you can see that the floor vertex misses the ceiling vertex by 1 unit, and so along this edge, we get a 1 unit thick, continuous seam of invisible wall from the ceiling leaking out. So this one's not actually too bad, because you're never really gonna jump off the edge right there. And then in Bowser in the Sky, we have something remarkably similar. Another wall on the corner of a walkway where there's a fire spitter nearby. And this floor vertex misses the ceiling vertex in exactly the same way as the previous one did, making me think that this may have been copy and pasted too. And so we end up with a very similar invisible wall. Note that this invisible wall only rises upwards until it meets the Goomba platform, so luckily, you don't have to worry about it affecting you up there. But if you were to jump off the edge right here, then you'd have to worry about it. So to reiterate, this type of invisible wall happens when a floor vertex and a ceiling vertex are meant to be aligned, but they're slightly misaligned, which lets some ceiling leak through the leaning wall. Now earlier, I said these cases happen due to the programmers failing to line up the vertices, but this type of invisible wall can also happen even if the programmers lined up the vertices perfectly. Specifically, it can happen if the structure is an object that rotates. See, if it's rotating like this, then it's basically guaranteed that the structure will go through certain angles that cause there to be slightly leaning walls, and so those walls can let ceiling leak through. So that's why the front and back of the structure would let ceiling leak through, due to misaligned vertices. But interestingly, even the sides of the structure can let ceiling leak through, because these vertices can have slight fluctuations to the left and right, which creates a leaning wall that lets ceiling leak through. Though note that these side ones would actually be classified as the previous cause of invisible walls, which was ceiling jutting out due to misaligned edge vertex. And even if the structure is rotating perfectly sideways, that can still cause invisible walls, because now we have edge vertices at weird angles. So let's look at some examples. The rolling log has some invisible walls. You can see that the short sides of the log basically always have some invisible walls on them, and the long sides of the log have invisible walls only at certain angles. And this was the one I was referring to earlier, about how there was another invisible wall in this area. And as luck would have it, the angle that the log starts at has an invisible wall on the long side of it. So before you do anything, there's already an invisible wall there ready to get you when you jump onto the log. So let me just recap all the invisible walls in this area. On the left side, we have the inner seam, the outer edge, and the smaller edge. Then on the right side, we have this edge, and then for the rolling log, it starts off with this invisible wall. So a regular journey through here could go through 4 different invisible walls, 2 on the starting side, 1 on the rolling log, and 1 on the far side. So this is just not a very friendly area. The swings in Rainbow Ride have some invisible walls. Specifically, both the blue rectangle part on the bottom and the yellow axle part on the top create invisible walls at certain angles. You probably won't run into the one on the yellow axle anytime soon, but the one on the blue rectangle can get in your way as you make your way across the swing.
What?
The crusher in the volcano has an invisible wall on just 1 frame, specifically on the first frame when it starts retracting back into the wall. So you could hit this one if you try jumping over the crusher while it's out. The rotating bridge in Whomp's Fortress has invisible walls at many different angles, though note that the invisible walls only come out of the very tip end of the bridge. That's because its cross-section is an upside-down triangle, which causes there to be an edge vertex at many different weird angles. And bonking on this one is usually pretty bad, because then you fall down the ramp.
What? Hello? Dude.
No, that blue coin. What was that invisible, dude? Are you shitting me, man?
What? The spinning triangle in TikTok Clock has some invisible walls, but just on the front side. You wouldn't think there'd be any there, but the floors on the top are subdivided midway through the edge, which is what gives it an edge vertex. So we already talked about how this gap has invisible walls in it, but even the triangle has invisible walls on it, which could easily mess you up and cause you to fall all the way down. Rotating elevators have invisible walls when they rotate around at the top of their movement, so if you thought it was annoying how they rotate around, now you know that it's even more annoying, because those rotations produce invisible walls. The rotating cubes in TikTok Clock have invisible walls when they rotate around, so you could hit one of those ones and fall down to your death. The rotating triangles in TikTok Clock also have invisible walls, both when they're rotating and at certain stationary angles, so these ones could also trip you up and make you fall down. The elevators that are on fixed tracks have invisible walls, since they tilt as they go around their pathing. Look at how many there are. This elevator was supposed to help us get around, not inhibit us from getting around by blocking us with invisible walls. Now for the most part, I'm just showing one instance of each object, because it's just not feasible to show every instance of an object in every position at every angle. But for these fixed track elevators, I'm making an exception. See, since they do the same movement every time, their invisible walls are the same every time, so it just feels more worth it to show each of the 3 fixed track elevators in their entirety. Think of it like a carnival ride. Not that rigged carnival game from earlier, but like a nice peaceful ride where you're sitting in the boat, nice and safe, and it's passing by the scary pirates or something. But in this case, you're riding on the elevator with me as we're watching all the invisible walls. So relax, take a breather. You earned it for getting this far into the video. We can just have a friendly conversation, me and you. Me, who's recording these voice lines months in advance, and you, who can't actually talk back. That'll work, right? So I hope you're enjoying the video so far. This is literally the video that's taken the most effort of any video I've ever made. So I hope you find it worth the effort. And don't worry, I'm not gonna disappear for forever after this video. I have a lot more video ideas that I wanna make. I got regular video ideas, YouTube short ideas, music video ideas. So if you wanna see all those, make sure to subscribe. And our elevator ride is almost over, so let me commemorate this occasion with a little poem. Before Here and Now, I was all on my own. Then you came around and I found my new home. A place for just us to talk about it all, and as an added plus, some invisible walls. So if you want my view, all joking aside, I love being with you on this elevator ride.
Oh my...
Oh.
And now, let me show you something cool you can do on these elevators. A down warp that can happen when you bonk. I know we already had one down warp, but this one works a little differently, so let me explain it. So here's the frame before Mario down warps. So let's go to a top-down view, show the floors, show the ceilings, and now zoom in. You can see that currently the floor juts out a bit, so in the unit square view, it's mostly purple but with some blue squares. Now let's walk through what happens on this frame. First, the elevator moves one frame forwards, which slightly changes its triangles. So now the ceiling is jutting out more, giving us some red squares. Then Mario moves forwards, not because of his quarter step movement, but because he's on a moving platform. See, when Mario's on a moving platform, like the elevator, then the platform moves Mario along with it every frame to keep him on it. Now normally, this platform displacement would keep Mario in the same relative spot on the platform. But here, because Mario was so close to the edge, and because these edges fluctuate a bit due to them only having unit precision, the platform displacement puts Mario off the edge. Like, now he's on a white square that isn't floor or ceiling. Now when a quarter step moves Mario off the edge, the game knows to put him into an airborne action. But this does not happen if the platform displacement moves him off the edge, because I guess they never expected that, since it's supposed to keep you in your same relative position on the platform. And so, Mario just stays in the action that he was already in, which is the grounded diving action. So like the other down warp, Mario's now in a grounded action, but in the air. And now Mario does his quarter steps. His first quarter step lands on a unit square that's only ceiling, meaning he moved into an invisible wall. So the quarter step returns that it got cancelled instead of that it went airborne. And like I mentioned earlier, any sliding movement that doesn't become airborne aligns Mario with the ground. And since Mario's not actually above the elevator at the moment, aligning him with the ground gives him a huge down warp, all the way to the floor down below. So it's similar to the previous down warp because we found a way to be in a ground action in the air and then slid into an invisible wall. But instead of using a turnaround to walk in midair, we used the displacement from the moving elevator. Then the ski lift in Cool Cool Mountain has some invisible walls, which makes sense because it tilts based on where Mario stands on it. Well, I guess most people just stand still when they ride the ski lift because they're already worried about falling off of it. But if you decide to jump, you could bonk on one of these invisible walls and fall down. The controllable platform in Hazy Maze Cave has some invisible walls, since it tilts both when Mario stands on it and when it bumps into a wall. Seesaws also tilt based on how Mario stands on them, so they can have invisible walls too, so you might bonk on them if you go near the seesaw's edge. The long wooden seesaw in Bob on Battlefield has some invisible walls, though they're just little tiny ones on the corners near Chain Chomp, so you'd have to be really unlucky to ever accidentally hit one of these ones. The big seesaws can also have invisible walls when they tilt at the right angle, and this one was hard to hit because you have to tilt it and then get into the right position really fast, so I kinda doubt anyone's ever hit this one by accident. And the squiggly seesaw in Bowser in the Sky has a lot of invisible walls from even the slightest tilt, and this one's very bad for speedrunners because as you're jumping across the seesaw, you can bonk and fall down to your death.
I was a bit confused of that, so I got a visible wall!
What? What? What was that? I've never seen that in my life.
Oh my god. Oh my god, he said it. What the fuck? Fix your shitty game. I'm doing 70. I'm sorry.
The loose floor panel in Big Boo's Haunt can have an invisible wall, which you could bonk on and fall all the way down into the water. Floating wooden boards can have invisible walls because they tilt based on Mario's position, but these invisible walls only occur on the sides of the platform that are away from Mario. That's because the platform updates its tilt instantly, and it's only the far sides of the platform that are walls that lean slightly forwards, meaning they let ceiling leak through. So you can't really hit these invisible walls because they stay away from you. It's like the platform is playing monkey in the middle with you and moving the invisible wall to wherever you aren't. When you fight Bowser for the second time, the stage itself rotates when Bowser jumps onto it. So as the platform is wobbling back and forth, it creates invisible walls. You're probably not going to hit these ones though, because if the stage is wobbling, you're most likely trying extra hard to stay on the stage and not going near the edges. Falling blocks rotate as they fall down, so you could end up hitting one of their invisible walls as you're traveling across the blocks. The coffins in Big Boo's Haunt rotate, so they have invisible walls. Specifically, they have invisible walls on the first frame that they start rising upwards, but no invisible walls on the downwards movement. Womps in Womp's Fortress can have invisible walls because they rotate when they attack, and these ones can happen both when the Womps fall down and rise up. Even King Womp has some invisible walls. It's almost like a defense mechanism. Like, a porcupine has quills for protection, whereas King Womp has invisible walls, which kind of are like really long, thin quills if you think about it.
What is that bonk? Hello? What the fuck is that?
The falling plank in Womp's Fortress has some invisible walls, but mainly just on one side of it as it falls down. Now this one was hard to hit, but I did find a way to do it. So first I go onto the plank, hit it once with a breakdance to get it wobbling, and then knock it down with a wall kick, which positions me perfectly to hit the invisible wall. IROC has some invisible walls, but only on the initial movement when he gets into position, not any time after that. And if you're really fast, you can hit these invisible walls. I don't know why you'd want to, but you can. Even Dory has invisible walls on the sides of his tail. But don't think of it as Dory attacking us. It's more like a sea creature who got their tail stuck in plastic and now can't get it off. So you could bonk on this invisible wall, but you could also be trying to swim onto Dory's tail and then suddenly you get downwarped to under Dory. Because remember, ceiling hitboxes downwarp Mario when he's in water. So yeah, that's the 7th cause of invisible walls, which we're gonna call ceiling juts out due to misaligned vertices. And now the whole Punnett square is filled out, so let's take a look at it. Basically, the top row is misaligned edge vertex, the bottom row is misaligned vertices, the left column is floor gap, and the right column is ceiling juts out. So these 4 causes are just all 4 combinations. And now we just have one more cause to do, which is the 8th cause, aka the final boss of the causes. This one's a weird and complicated one, but don't worry, we're gonna build up to it like we always do. So, imagine we have 4 floors arranged like this. I'm gonna label them A, B, C, D, so that it's easier to talk about them. And let's place Mario in the middle, so he's airborne and about to fall down. Now, when Mario's in the air, the game calculates which floor is directly below him. This is because as he's falling, the game checks to see if he landed yet by comparing Mario's height to the height of the floor below him. If Mario's about to move lower than the floor, then that means he landed, and so then the game puts him directly on top of the floor in the landing action. But now let's go back to when Mario was still in the air. As I explained, the game needs to know which floor is directly below him. But how does it calculate this? Your intuition might say, start at Mario and draw an arrow straight down. And whatever floor the arrow hits first is the floor directly under Mario. If we do that, we get floor C. But that's just what our intuition says. What does the game actually do? Well, to show what happens, we're gonna use a table. So what the game does is go through the floors one by one in order from highest to lowest, which in this case would be A, B, C, D. For each one, it checks 2 things: whether Mario's within the bounds of the floor laterally, and whether he's above the floor. So for floor A, Mario's within the bounds, but not above it. For floor B, Mario's not within the bounds because he's too far to the right, but he is above it. For floor C, Mario's within the bounds and above it. Now, as soon as the game finds a floor that meets both criteria, it returns that floor as the one directly under Mario. It doesn't bother checking the rest of the floors, because those ones should be further down than the floor Mario's gonna land on, and so those further down floors shouldn't affect his trajectory. You know, because he's gonna land before he goes down that far. So anyway, that's the process that the game does to find the floor directly under Mario, which found floor C. And our intuition also said floor C. So in this case, the game logic matches our intuition. However, there are some obscure cases where the game logic does not match our intuition. For example, let's say we have 2 floors arranged like this. Let's call them A and B, and let's say Mario's here. Same question, which floor is directly below Mario? Well, first let's do our intuition. If we draw an arrow straight down from Mario, then we hit floor A first, and so floor A should be the one directly below him. But what does the game logic do? Well, once again, let's get out the table. So the game goes through the floors from highest to lowest and returns the first one for which Mario's both within the bounds and above. Now both floor A and floor B satisfy both criteria, so really it all comes down to which floor the game checks first. So if floor A is checked first, then it's the one under Mario, but if floor A were considered lower than floor B, then floor B would be checked first and it'd be the one under Mario. As I've mentioned, the game checks the floors from highest to lowest, but that's a little ambiguous here because some of floor A is above floor B and some of floor A is below floor B. So it's not exactly clear which floor is higher up and gets to be checked first. But don't worry, the programmers figured out a very simple technique to order floors. One might even say a little too simple, because the way they programmed it is, all floors are sorted by the height of their first vertex. Let me explain. As you know, every floor triangle has 3 vertices: the first vertex, the second vertex, and the third vertex. But for our discussion here, we're only concerned with the first vertex. And to be clear, when I say first vertex, I literally just mean the vertex that the programmers listed first of the 3 vertices in the code. So a floor triangle's first vertex could be its highest vertex, its lowest vertex, or a vertex in the middle. Basically, you can't really make any assumptions about which vertex is the first one, as it's essentially random. So using the first vertex as the basis for floor heights was kind of a weird move on the developer's part. Now let's go back to the first floor layout, and let's say the floor's first vertices are arranged like this. But let me make a little change. Instead of having all the pink circles be labeled V1, I'll instead label them by the floor's name, just to make it easier to follow. Okay, so the game goes through the floors from highest to lowest, specifically from highest first vertex to lowest first vertex. So here, first that'd be floor A's first vertex, then floor B's first vertex, then floor C's first vertex, and then floor D's first vertex. So the game would order the floors as A, B, C, D. But that's just for this arrangement of first vertices. They could instead be arranged like this, like this, like this. But even now, the order would still go A, B, C, D. So for these floors, it doesn't really matter how the first vertices are arranged, because the heights of their first vertices would always still be in the same order. But if we have a floor layout like this, then it actually does matter how the first vertices are arranged. They could be like this, like this, like this, or like this. If the first vertices are arranged like this, then floor A has the higher first vertex. Floor A is considered higher up in the order. Floor A gets checked first and passes the check. Floor A is considered the floor directly below Mario, and so if Mario falls, he lands on floor A. On the other hand, if the first vertices are arranged like this, then floor B has the higher first vertex. Floor B is considered higher up in the order. Floor B gets checked first and passes the check. Floor B is considered the floor directly below Mario, and so if Mario falls, he lands on floor B. In other words, he passes straight through floor A. Because remember, he falls until he lands on the floor directly below him and ignores any floors considered lower than that one. So this is a phenomenon called floor overshadowing. To summarize it, it's when our intuition says that floor A should be above floor B, but instead, the game considers floor A to be below floor B due to the heights of their first vertices. And the result of this is that Mario can't land on the portion of floor A that's directly above floor B. To illustrate this, I'll replace that portion with a dashed line, meaning that that portion of floor A is overshadowed by floor B. But it's only that one portion, so Mario can land on the left part of floor A, because even though floor B still gets checked first, it fails the check since Mario's not within the bounds, he's too far left. And then floor A passes the check, so it's considered the floor under Mario. And then similarly, Mario can land on the right part of floor A, because once again, floor B is checked first, fails, floor A is checked next, and succeeds. But when Mario goes in the middle, floor B is checked first, and this time succeeds. So floor A is never even considered, and so Mario can pass straight through floor A to land on floor B. And the setup doesn't have to look exactly like this, with the bigger floor above the smaller floor. Instead, it could look like this, with the smaller floor above the bigger floor. Here, the bigger floor's first vertex is above the smaller floor's first vertex, so the smaller floor gets completely overshadowed, like you can't land on any part of it. And the setup could even look like this, where the smaller floor juts out of the bigger floor. Here, both triangles' first vertices are at the same height, but one of them still has to be sorted higher up in the order, which in this case would just be whichever triangle is stored first in the code. So even though the two triangles' first vertices are at the same height, it can still turn out that the bigger floor's first vertex is considered above the smaller floor's first vertex. So once again, the smaller floor gets completely overshadowed and you can't touch any part of it. So let's look at some examples. In Lethal Lava Land, we have this little black hexagon structure that shoots fire. And let me remove the fire to make it easier to see. So this black hexagon structure juts out of the platform below it, whose triangles look like this. And I'm making them orange, which will signify that they're the ones doing the overshadowing. Now, their first vertices are all here, so no surprises there, their first vertex heights are just at the height of the platform. But now let's look at the 6 sides of the black hexagon structure to see where its floor's first vertices are. On the first side, the triangles look like this, and I'm making these ones blue, which will signify that they're the ones being overshadowed, or at least they might be. So these triangles have their first vertices on the bottom right corner. So this is the exact scenario we just talked about, where we have a floor jutting out of another floor and their first vertex heights are tied. And in this case, it just so happens that this blue first vertex is considered lower than the orange first vertex. So these blue triangles get completely overshadowed, meaning Mario can't touch them at all. But that's just for this side. Let's look at the other sides too. On the second side, the triangles look like this, have their first vertices on the bottom right corner, and so they also get overshadowed. On the third side, the triangles look like this, have their first vertices on the bottom right corner, and so they get overshadowed. On the fourth side, the triangles look like this, have their first vertices on the bottom right corner, and so they also get overshadowed. On the fifth side, the triangles look like this, have their first vertices on the bottom right corner, and so they also get overshadowed. And then we have the sixth side. Now for the other 5 sides, the triangles were subdivided from top left to bottom right. But for this last side, the triangles are instead subdivided from top right to bottom left. So that gives us this triangle on the right, whose first vertex is on the bottom right, and so it gets overshadowed. And then we have this triangle on the left, whose first vertex is on the top right. So of all the triangles on the side of this black hexagon structure, this is the only triangle that doesn't get completely overshadowed. So as you're playing around near this black hexagon structure, you'll notice that you can just walk straight through it, because 11 of the 12 floors on its side get overshadowed, meaning they effectively have no collision. But if you go onto that one blue triangle that isn't overshadowed, then you actually can walk on it. And of course, the top of the structure isn't overshadowed either. Then in Bowser in the Sky, we have this gray spike jutting out of the yellow disc. So let's look at this one. The yellow disc has its triangles like this, whose first vertices are all here. So they're just at the height of the disc. Now let's look at the spikes triangles. On this first side, the floor triangle has its first vertex at the top. So this one does not get overshadowed. Then on the second side, the floor triangle also has its first vertex at the top, so this one also doesn't get overshadowed. Then on the third side, the floor triangle still has its first vertex at the top, so this one also doesn't get overshadowed. And then on the fourth side, the floor triangle has its first vertex on the bottom left. Now even though it's at the same height as the yellow disc's first vertex, it's considered lower, so that means this one side of the spike gets completely overshadowed. And so if you're playing around near here, you can actually just walk straight inside the spike by passing through that blue floor. And hey look, I turned Mario into a traffic cone. But note that if you go too near any of the other sides of the spike, you'll clip onto those floors and get ejected from the spike. Then in Snowman's Land, there's this freezing water that has some chunks of snow in it. And we're going to be focusing on this chunk of snow. So the chunk of snow is on top of this orange floor, whose first vertex is here. You know, just at the height of the floor in the water. Now let's look at the sides of the chunk of snow. On this first side, the floor triangle has its first vertex on the bottom right. This ties the height of the orange first vertex, but this blue one is considered lower, so this triangle gets overshadowed.
Okay. Bum 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 ba da da dum. Bum 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 ba da da da. Bum 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 ba da da da. Ba da 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 da. Okay, I think I'm done with this anyways. Oop, not Blender. Wrong thing. That one. Yeah, this is done. Pretty much. Yeah. Let me, I exported it. I did the thing. Let me go ahead and examine that. Okay, cool. Let me stick all this in a zip file form. I don't know. It's only been 2 hours. Okay. Is there anything I want to do? My god, that's all my commissions done. Wow. I guess I can work on the sunshine map a little bit. But first I'll go get something to eat really quick. Yeah, we're gonna store do that. Let me go ahead and repost the stream. Okay. Let me... Compiling scripts. What? What about that? Does that work? Oh. Whatever it did, it worked. Excellent. So, let's see. Something I want to do is... So the portals here. I initially had... I initially had basically what the way that I made it do the wobbly wavy thing was moving it back and forth gently. But the problem is that after I did that and then I like copied and pasted a bunch of them to like make portals all around the place, they the way that it handles animations, like the position specifically, is that it like moving it from here to another place, basically the animation applied only to the place that it was moved to and the old place, so that it would like go back and forth really fast or something, and it basically broke it. And yeah, I need to figure out how to make it wobble. Let's see. Perlin noise might be the play. How do I add property? Come on, don't trash on me now. Oh yeah, I should probably... Go. Hey, Ripa. Reminds me, I need a thing over here, but I need to do that in Blender. Don't hop in. Oh, yeah, I'm doing good. How are you? Let's see. You're doing good? That's good. to see this map. Wow. Lucky for you, it is available. I'm just doing some updates really quick on it.
Show me your eyes when you speak pretty lies. I'm listening. Fucked up and wasted, and oh so sedated. We're glistening. Oh, we're bleeding inside. I'll take the hits. I said I'm fine. I'm whistling. Come to me, baby, I'm yours if you take me tonight. Oh, I'll give you everything I've got. I know it's not enough. Honey, I'm hurting. Beauty, we're burning. We fell from above. You break me down, then pick me up. I wanna be enough. I'm never leaving, sweetie. I'm breathing. I just need the love. Oh, God made an angel and gave her to me. I see you. I see you. Her wings fall and scatters. My heart fucking shatters. I need you. I need you. Just
Coyote, hi.
I said I'm yours. You said you're mine. I'll keep you. Use me up, use me. I'm yours if you take me tonight. Oh, I'll give you everything I've got. I know it's not enough. Honey, I'm hurting. Beauty, we're burning. We fell from above. You break me down, then pick me up. I wanna be enough. I'm never leaving, sweetie. I'm breathing. I just need the love. I just need the I'll give you everything I've got. I know it's not enough. Honey, I'm hurting. Beauty, we're burning. We fell from above.
Why is it over there?
You break me down, then pick me up. I wanna be enough. I'm never leaving. just need the love. Oh, I just need the love.
I'm doing well. How are you doing? Wait a minute. I want maybe a couple hot dogs or something. They're probably not very good though. I don't know, what does Shell have?
CFO Benjamin Crisp to come in and streamline 95% of your staff with a low fee of all of their salaries combined. No more HR department, no one to scrutinize your decision making. It's a no-brainer. Come on down to IBS.
Ah, that's why the origin's not in the right spot. Man, that's stupid. Oh no, I see. The origin is in the right place. It's just what is this? Oh, what is this down here? It's just a spare one, I guess. Oh goodness, what? Oh, thank you. Whoa! Why? Why are they here? There we go. That's better. Okay.
You shine, you do it brighter than the star. Everyone, we got a song that needs to be sung, and when we come together, the world will sing as one. And right now's our time. Now more than ever, baby, yeah. Today, we need each other more than ever. Tell your mama that you love her. Tell your friends that you love her. Because we need each other now more than ever. Tell your daddy that you love him. Tell a stranger that you love him. Because we need each other now more than ever. Dr. Sung, oh, I love you. Lord Phobos, oh, I love you. And we need each other now more than ever. Half Hogan, oh, I love you. You've been a couch, oh, I love you. And we need each other now more than
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the solution to our problem. Are you unhappy, girl, in this confusing world where everything you earn is getting left
Thank you.
Luke says contract.
Yeah, I saw.
You saw. Wasn't interested. But I didn't know it was him.
That's funny. Wait. Huh?
Is that a good idea?
Oh, damn. Damn, you're right. Alright, fine. I love you. I got jerky chat. Chicken. All right, I'm gonna keep working on this, but I think I'm gonna do it off stream. So let's go raid. We're gonna go raid Tauntaun. It's their birthday. It is Tauntaun's birthday. The silly. All right. Oh, they're playing Galaga. Let's go. Okay. All right. I'll see you guys later, alligators. Thanks for stopping by. Bye.